Section 1. The bombs drop a world worth getting lost in. There is something about the Fallout universe that gets under your skin and stays there long after you've put the controller down. Maybe it's the hiss of a Pip-Boy screen flickering to life in a ruined building. Maybe it's the way afternoon light catches the dust motes floating above a skeleton that has been sitting in the same chair for over 200 years, holding the same coffee mug, never once imagining the story we'd eventually build around it. Or maybe it's just the particular flavor of dread that comes from wandering down a hallway in some forgotten vault, listening to the ambient silence, knowing with absolute certainty that something happened here, something terrible, something strange, something that no one alive is around to explain. Fallout is, at its core, a series about stories that didn't survive. The world it takes place in is a graveyard of civilizations, each one buried under rubble and radiation, with only scraps of holotapes and handwritten notes and environmental detail to hint at what was lost. And the people who made those games, first Interplay, then Obsidian, then Bethesda, understood that the most compelling mystery is the one you never fully explain. Leave the lights off. Give the player a flashlight. Let them come to their own conclusions. That's what we're doing tonight. We're going deep into the wasteland, past the towns and the faction quest lines and the main story beats, and we're looking at the places the developers built but never explained. The questions that have circulated for years across fan forums, wikis, and late-night YouTube rabbit holes. The details so strange and specific that they couldn't be accidental, but whose meaning has never once been confirmed. 101 of them. There are 6 mainline Fallout games to pull from. Fallout 1, Fallout 2, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76 plus a wealth of DLC content that sometimes ventures further into the weird than the base games ever dared. If you've played all of them, some of these will feel like rediscovering something you half remembered but couldn't quite place. If you're newer to the series, this might read like a guided tour through the most fascinating museum you've never been to. One where all the exhibits are horrifying. We'll be moving through the world the way a veteran explorer does, not rushing toward quest markers, but getting distracted by unmarked graves and weird radio signals in rooms that don't match any floor plan on the map, because that's where Fallout keeps its best material. Not in dialogue trees, in the spaces between. The Fallout universe is officially set in an alternate history America that diverged from our timeline sometime in the mid-20th century. The post-war consumer optimism of the 1950s never gave way to the counterculture revolution of the 1960s. Instead, it just kept going: bigger houses, shinier cars, more cheerful advertisements, all while the resources ran out, and the governments of the world turned quietly monstrous underneath their gleaming surfaces. The technology advanced in strange and specific ways. Nuclear power became the backbone of everyday life, while computers somehow still ran on vacuum tubes, and robots walked around in shapes that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd only ever seen a science fiction magazine and no actual humans. When the bombs finally fell on the 23rd of October 2077, 2 centuries before the events of the first game, it happened all at once. A 2-hour exchange that ended the old world and started the new one. And into that new world crawled the survivors, the ones who made it to vaults, the ones who hid in cellars, the ones who were just lucky enough to be somewhere the Fallout didn't kill immediately. What they built with the rubble became the series' canvas. Now, one of the things that makes the Fallout universe so endlessly interesting to dig through is the question of scale. These games take place over geographically specific regions: the Capital Wasteland, the Mojave Desert, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but they gesture constantly at a much larger world that exists just off-screen. The rest of America, the rest of the planet, all those other places where people crawled out of the wreckage and tried to make something, we'll come back to that. But first, the details. The mysteries hidden in the places you can actually walk through. Let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there, and if you haven't subscribed yet, take a second to do that now. It genuinely helps more than you might think. Section 2. The Commonwealth's hidden dead environmental storytelling and the stories bones tell. Walk into any building in Fallout 4 and you'll likely find at least one skeleton, probably more. They're draped across car seats and slumped against walls and arranged in beds with their hands folded like someone tucked them in before the world ended. At a certain point, you stop noticing them the way you stop noticing furniture. But that's exactly what the designers were counting on. The skeletons in Fallout aren't decorative, or at least not just decorative. The best ones are complete short stories told entirely through posture, placement, and proximity to other objects. And when you slow down enough to actually read them, the world goes from feeling like a backdrop to feeling like a place where real people once lived and died in very specific, very sad, very strange ways. Mystery 1. The Man Who Wouldn't Leave His Chair. In Fallout 4, scattered across the Commonwealth, there are dozens of scenes of families who clearly had advance warning that something bad was coming and chose to face it in whatever way made sense to them. But there's one particular setup and variations of it appear in more than one location that tells a story about a specific kind of person. An older man, seated at a kitchen table, facing the window that overlooks what used to be a backyard. There's a bottle nearby, sometimes an empty one. There are photographs on the mantle that you can look at but not pick up. The bottle is in his hand. He knew. He sat down with his drink, faced the window, and he waited for it. There's no note. There's no explanation. There's just a man who decided that if the world was going to end, he was going to watch it happen from his own kitchen, in his own chair, with a glass of something that helped. Whoever placed that skeleton made a deliberate decision about where he would sit and what he would be holding and which direction he would be facing. Nothing about that is accidental. And because there's no text attached, no quest marker pointing to it, most players walk right past him on their way to the loot. Mystery 2. The Gibson Family. One of the earliest examples of environmental storytelling confirmed as intentional by the Fallout community is the Gibson family scene in Fallout 3. You're sent to collect something from some skeletons in a nursery. When you find the location, you discover Mr. Gibson's skeleton and a short distance away, two smaller skeletons, clearly children. His skeleton is positioned with his arms around theirs. He went looking for his kids when the bombs fell and found them. He held them while the world ended. The game gives you no dialogue about this. No one mentions it. It's simply there, tucked into the corner of a nursery, waiting for you to notice. The fact that the child skeletons are present but there's no maternal skeleton anywhere in the building opens its own question. Where was Mrs. Gibson? Was she at work? Was she somewhere else in the city? Did she survive the initial blast only to find her family like this? No answers exist, just the arrangement. Mystery 3. The Lovers Under the Overpass. Scattered throughout the wasteland are scenes of couples who clearly died together by choice. Two skeletons close to each other, sometimes holding hands, sometimes not positioned in places that don't make tactical or practical sense for survival. Under a highway overpass with a bottle of wine and two glasses, on a rooftop patio, in the middle of a field. These scenes suggest people who heard the sirens and decided there was only one person they wanted to be with when it ended. What makes these small scenes haunting isn't the death itself. Fallout is saturated with death. What makes them land is the specificity. Someone picked up two wine glasses and two skeletons and placed them deliberately close, at the right angle, with the right accompanying details. The care that went into building those moments is visible if you slow down enough to look. Mystery 4. The Survivors Who Made It for a While. Some of the most textured environmental stories in Fallout 4 aren't about the moment the bombs fell. They're about what happened afterward, in the days and weeks and months before the radiation fully took hold or before a roving pack of ferals found whoever was hiding in that building. In a handful of locations, particularly in apartment buildings and hospitals, you find evidence of small survivor communities that formed in the immediate aftermath of the war. Handwritten calendars where someone kept crossing off days. Food supplies that clearly ran out over a period of weeks. Fortified doors that were eventually broken through. Bodies of people who were clearly protecting other people, positioned between a door and a cluster of other remains. These are stories about the second wave of death, not the instant vaporization of the war itself, but the slow strangulation of a world with no infrastructure, no medicine, and no way to know if help was coming. Fallout never dramatizes this period with quest content. It just leaves the physical evidence for you to find and interpret. Mystery 5. The Nursery in Sanctuary Hills. Before you even leave the starting area in Fallout 4, right there in Sanctuary Hills, where the sole survivor's pre-war home still stands, there's a nursery, Sean's room. But the room across the hall, another nursery, belonging to the neighbor's baby, tells its own story if you pay attention. The crib has been moved slightly from its original position. The changing table has been cleared of its supplies. The baby mobile has been partially dismantled and its components laid out on a dresser as if someone was inventorying what they had. That baby never made it to the vault. The neighbor family didn't make it to the vault. And someone, probably the baby's mother or father, spent time in those frantic minutes before the bus arrived, doing what parents do, taking stock of supplies, preparing the diaper bag, making sure everything was in order. They never got to use any of it. Fallout 4 begins with a family that makes it to the vault, but Sanctuary Hills is full of families that didn't. Mystery 6. The Bodies in the Water. Throughout the Commonwealth, there are submerged ruins accessible through radioactive water that contain a very specific kind of scene. Bodies at desks, still seated at workstations, still in the positions they were in when the bombs hit. Underwater offices where everyone simply went forward with their workday, right up until the moment the wave hit the windows and came inside. What makes these scenes work is the particular stillness of underwater spaces in Fallout 4. The radiation creates a visual static. Things drift gently, dust motes catch the murky light, and the bodies are just there, at their desks, with their work in front of them, still showing up. It's an image that captures something specific about the way the war was presented to the American public in Fallout's lore, not as an inevitability, but as an unexpected escalation. Most people didn't know it was coming. The sirens gave them minutes, not hours. Mystery 7. The Skeleton with the Teddy Bear. By now, this is almost a Fallout meme, but it started as something genuinely affecting. Small skeletons' children positioned next to stuffed animals. Sometimes the skeleton's arm is arranged to be holding the toy. Sometimes the toy is just lying nearby, as if it fell out of the child's hand. Sometimes both child-sized skeletons in a pair are positioned this way. These are deliberately placed to communicate a specific thing, that the children who died in these buildings did so holding onto the same objects of comfort they would have held during a thunderstorm or a nightmare. Their last moments were frightened moments. The teddy bear, or the rag doll, or the toy robot was what they reached for when they were scared. Fallout uses these images carefully enough that they don't feel exploitative. They feel like documentation. The war was real. People died. Children died holding things that mattered to them. The teddy bear isn't morbid decor. It's a grave marker. Mystery 8. The Note That Has No Quest. Fallout 4 is filled with handwritten notes tucked into drawers and filing cabinets that reference people and events that no quest ever acknowledges. A note from a woman named Patricia to her sister Margaret. A grocery list that ends with the sentence, "If there's still a store, by Thursday." An angry note from a building superintendent to a tenant about noise complaints, dated 3 days before the bombs fell. These notes connect to nothing. They don't lead anywhere. There's no follow-up. They're scraps of ordinary life preserved in amber, someone's Tuesday, someone's ongoing argument, someone's grocery run. Their ordinariness is precisely what makes them stick. Mystery 9. The Pair in the Bathtub. In one of Fallout 4's urban areas, there is a bathtub on the second floor of a collapsed apartment building in which two skeletons have been placed side by side with a collection of empty bottles and a handful of pre-war money arranged nearby. The money is facing away from them, as if it was placed there as a joke or a comment. Wealth meant nothing when the world ended. Two people climbed into a bathtub together and decided they would wait out the end of the world in the same place they started every morning of their lives. Whether that's romantic or simply pragmatic, whether the tub was chosen for shelter or for sentiment, the game doesn't say. The image lands differently depending on who you are and what you're carrying when you find it. Mystery 10. The Cabot House and its Occupants. If you do the Cabot House questline in Fallout 4, you encounter one of the game's weirdest deep dive stories. A family who has been alive for centuries because of a serum derived from an ancient artifact. The father, Lorenzo Cabot, discovered something in the Rub al-Khali desert that gave him, and by extension his family, a form of near immortality. The serum they produce has extraordinary properties. The patriarch became increasingly unstable. The family has been managing him in a locked wing of their mansion for a century. The mystery the game raises and never fully answers is what exactly Lorenzo found in that desert. The artifact he brought back is referred to as ancient beyond any known civilization's timeline. The powers it granted him seem to go beyond simple chemistry. There are faint suggestions in his dialogue and his journals that whatever was out in that desert was neither human nor pre-war American. Lorenzo's own explanations become increasingly unhinged over time, which makes it impossible to take them at face value. But his family has been alive for 300 years. Something out there in the sand did something to them. The Cabot House questline ends without resolving this, and no other content in the game ever picks it up. The artifact sits in the lore the way a strange rock sits in a field, clearly significant, clearly out of place, and completely unexplained. Mystery 11. Diamond City's pre-war layout. Diamond City was built inside Fenway Park, the old baseball stadium. The settlers enclosed themselves in the high walls of the outfield and built a city inside. But if you look carefully at the shape of the settlement, there are certain architectural choices that make no sense from a pure functionality standpoint. Internal structures, positioned in ways that seem to reference the old baseball diamond layout rather than optimize for livable space. This suggests one of two things. Either the original settlers deliberately preserved something of the stadium's geometry as a form of cultural memory, or the developers layered in a kind of spatial history that most players walk past without recognizing. Either way, Diamond City is built on the bones of a very specific kind of pre-war optimism, America's pastime, surrounded by walls, turned into a fortress. No one in the game points this out. It's just there, in the layout, waiting. Mystery 12. The terminal that predicts the bombs. In one of Fallout 4's suburban areas, you can find a home terminal whose last entries were made in the final hours before the war. The entries start normally appointments, reminders, family notes. Then, across a series of entries dated the 23rd of October 2077, the tone changes. Someone writing with increasing alarm. Something's wrong. The radio is saying something. The lights in the city are different. Then the last entry, mid-sentence. Terminals like this exist throughout the series. They're Fallout's version of the final transmission, the message cut short, the sentence that never found its period. Each one is a small act of precision writing on the part of the developers. They had to think carefully about what someone would write in those last minutes and make it feel real enough to land without becoming melodramatic. Mystery 13. The survivor who made it to 2090. Scattered through Fallout 4's ruins are dates carved into walls and written in notebook entries that suggest some people survived the initial war and the immediate aftermath and kept going for years, for decades. A carved date of 2090 on a cellar wall. A series of marks on a doorframe tracking someone's height over what appears to be a span of several years, starting at child height and ending well above. The Fallout lore establishes that the first decades after the war were survivable for some people in some locations, particularly those with access to sheltered spaces, pre-war preserved food, and clean water. The vaults were supposed to represent systematic survival, but plenty of people made it without vaults. Their stories almost never become quests or NPCs. They exist as background radiation, pun intended, in the environmental detail. Mystery 14. The robot that waited. In several locations throughout Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, you encounter robots, Mr. Handys, Protectrons, various models that are still running, still performing the tasks they were assigned before the bombs fell. A Mr. Handy who continues to service a hotel that has been empty for over 2 centuries, diligently cleaning rooms that no guest will ever occupy. A Protectron security unit still patrolling the perimeter of a building whose occupants are long dead. These robots are the tragedy of the series in compressed form. They were told to do a job, they did the job, they kept doing the job. For 200 years, they did the job. And the question that none of them can answer, the question that makes their cheerful servitude feel unbearable, is whether anyone programmed them with the capacity to understand that the job no longer means anything. Whether they know, whether that distinction matters to them. Mystery 15. The message on the wall. In a small number of locations in Fallout 3 and a few in Fallout 4, there are messages painted or scratched onto walls by people who clearly had something specific they wanted to leave behind. Not inventory lists, not survival instructions, personal statements. I'm sorry. We were here. I found a way out. I don't know where it goes. One particularly haunting one from Fallout 3, which many players remember finding in a metro tunnel, simply says a name, presumably whoever wrote it. Just their name, scratched in the plaster, in a place where no one who knew that name would ever come. Identity. Even at the end of everything, they wanted to leave their name behind somewhere. Section 3. Vaults, the architecture of experiments gone wrong. The vaults are Fallout's most celebrated world-building device and also one of its most genuinely disturbing conceits. On the surface, they are exactly what they claim to be. Reinforced underground shelters built by the Vault-Tec Corporation at the behest of the United States government, designed to house carefully selected populations through the apocalypse. And some of them functioned roughly as advertised. Most of them did not. The reveal that unfolds across the series slowly, over multiple games, through terminal entries and holotapes, and the physical state of each vault when you find it, is that almost every vault was designed to be an experiment. Vault-Tec, with the full knowledge and backing of the US government and a consortium of major corporations, used the promise of shelter as a mechanism for human experimentation. People who believed they were being saved were actually being enrolled, without their knowledge or consent, in long-term behavioral and biological studies. And then the bombs fell, and the experiments ran. The Amazon Prime Fallout show confirmed something that had been speculated about for years. The decision to design the vaults as experimental facilities came from a corporate board meeting attended by representatives of Vault-Tec, the Enclave, and several of the largest pre-war companies, including Robco Industries, Robert House's company. The goal was ostensibly to gather data that would be useful for long-term space habitation, but the subtext was something colder. A select group of people wanted to control whatever civilization emerged on the other side of the apocalypse. The vaults were a way of managing the gene pool, the behavioral norms, and the cultural memory of the survivors. What they actually produced was chaos. Because you can't control a human being by locking them in a vault with a bad set of rules for 100 years and expect them to behave the way your pre-war hypothesis predicted. People are more unpredictable than that, more resilient, more self-destructive. The experiments almost universally went sideways in ways Vault-Tec apparently never anticipated, which either says something about the fundamental hubris of their social engineering project or simply reflects the impossibility of modeling human behavior at that scale over that time frame. Let's walk through some of the strangest and most mysterious vaults in the series. Mystery 16. Vault 11 and the Sacrifice Protocol. Vault 11, found in the Mojave Wasteland in Fallout, New Vegas, is one of the series' most carefully constructed moral horror stories. When the vault's inhabitants entered, they were given a single instruction by the vault's computer system. Once per year, one resident must be selected for sacrifice. If the selection is made and carried out, the vault's life support will continue. If no sacrifice is made, the vault's life support will be terminated, and everyone will die. This instruction was a lie. The actual protocol was the opposite. If the vault's inhabitants ever reached the moral backbone to collectively refuse the sacrifice, the computer was programmed to open the vault doors and congratulate them. The Vault-Tec experiment was about measuring how long it would take a human community to comply with an arbitrary authority demanding murder, and what social structures they would build to cope with that compliance. What the terminal records and audio logs in Vault 11 reveal is that the inhabitants complied for decades. They built political systems around the selection process. They had elections, campaigns, attack ads. People ran for office on platforms of protecting their neighbors, which meant, in practice, being willing to be sacrificed themselves. Heroes were made. Traitors, too. The Vault's history mirrors the entire arc of political civilization in a compressed, horrifying package. The records also show that by the end, when only a handful of people were left, they finally refused. The computer congratulated them. The vault doors opened. 4 of the 5 survivors went back in and killed themselves. They couldn't live with what they'd done over the preceding decades. One person walked out. The game never tells you who that person is. There's a model for them in the game files, a survivor who was supposed to appear at some point in the world, but they were cut before release. Whoever walked out of Vault 11 carrying that weight is somewhere in the Mojave, and we never meet them. Mystery 17. Vault 77 and the Man with the Puppets. Vault 77 exists in the lore almost entirely through a webcomic that Bethesda published as promotional material for Fallout 3. It was stocked with a single human resident and several crates of puppets. The implication is that someone at Vault-Tec had either a very specific hypothesis about human psychology and isolation, or a sense of humor that was genuinely difficult to understand. The man placed in Vault 77 went slowly, methodically strange over a period of years. He gave each puppet a distinct personality. He had long conversations with them. He developed a complex internal mythology around their relationships with each other and with him. When a King of Spades puppet was taken by a radroach, he mounted a military campaign of retribution against the local radroach population. The thing about Vault 77 that makes it more than just a comedy sketch is the question that sits underneath it. What is the minimum viable human companion? What is the absolute lowest common denominator of relationship that will keep a person psychologically functional? The answer, apparently, is a felt puppet with googly eyes if you invest enough imagination in it. The man in Vault 77 remained, by all appearances, sane or at least consistently himself through years of complete isolation because he built a community out of materials that weren't supposed to have personalities. In Fallout 3, you can find a note that references Vault 77 and a single puppet. No further explanation is given. Mystery 18. Vault 92 and the White Noise Experiment. Vault 92 sits in the Capital Wasteland in Fallout 3 as a vault that sold itself on a very specific premise. It was a sanctuary for musicians. The world's best living classical and jazz and folk performers were told that their talents would be preserved, that the vault would protect living cultural heritage. It was an offer that appealed to precisely the kind of person who would otherwise never have considered signing up. The White Noise Experiment was simple in design and catastrophic in execution. Ultra-low frequency sound, broadcast through the vault's ambient systems, was intended to suppress normal behavioral inhibitions and implant behavioral suggestions in the residents. Vault-Tech's goal was to understand whether covert acoustic manipulation could be used to create controllable populations. The side effect discovered when one musician picked up a fire axe and killed 3 of his fellow residents was that the suggestions weren't quite as controllable as the researchers hoped. When you explore Vault 92, you find it has been completely overtaken by the consequences of that experiment. The bodies tell the story of a vault that descended into violence not because of external threat or resource scarcity, but because a system they lived inside was quietly making them want to hurt each other. The researchers' terminals document the escalation with a clinical detachment that is somehow worse than horror. Subject V9-2071. 7 became violent at 0300 hours. Security was called. 4 entries later, we may need to reconsider the frequency. The experiment kept running. They adjusted the frequency. People kept killing each other. Mystery 19. Vault 87 and what the FEV was really for. Vault 87 inches. Fallout 3 is the origin point for the Capital Wasteland's super mutant population. The Vault's experiment involved exposing its inhabitants to the forced evolutionary virus, the same compound that Tim Kaine would later, in 2023, confirm was the reason China launched its nuclear strike against the United States. FEV was developed as a potential super soldier program, transforming human biology into something more robust, more powerful, and considerably less recognizably human. The mystery of Vault 87 isn't what happened to the people inside. That's documented. They became super mutants, and the super mutants who emerged eventually began capturing surface dwellers and turning them too, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of FEV-driven conversion. The mystery is how Vault 87's experiment fits into the broader Vault-Tec Enclave project. Because FEV was a government project, and Vault-Tec was a government project. And the goal of using the vaults as data collection mechanisms for a future human colonization of space, or a future resettling of Earth under controlled conditions, required knowing what FEV would do to large populations over multi-generational timeframes. Vault 87 wasn't just an experiment in bioengineering. It was a test run for one possible future of the human species, one that the people being converted had no vote in. Mystery 20. Vault 101 and the lie about the outside. In Fallout 3, you grew up in Vault 101. Its experiment, as you eventually discover, was to never open, ever. The residents were told the vault would open when the surface was safe, and the surface was never declared safe, and so the vault was supposed to remain sealed indefinitely, a generational study of a human community in complete isolation. The deeper layer is what the overseers were told. In the vault's own records, the overseer position was secretly a planted Vault-Tec operative whose job was to maintain the illusion through fabricated radio transmissions recorded before the war, describing a surface world even more destroyed than the actual reality. The vault's residents were being lied to in two directions simultaneously, lied to about when it would be safe to leave, and lied to about what was out there. The experiment wasn't studying how humans adapt to isolation. It was studying how effectively a population can be controlled through the curation of information, how well a narrative about the outside world shapes behavior inside a closed system. What Vault 101 was actually testing was propaganda. Mystery 21, Vault 95 and the Recovery Experiment. Vault 95 inches. Fallout 4 was designed for a very specific kind of person, chem addicts. The vault was presented as a rehabilitation facility, staffed and equipped to help residents overcome their addictions. For 5 years, that's exactly what it was. Residents made genuine progress. Communities formed. People got better. Then the vault's hidden chem supply was activated. A stockpile concealed inside the walls, accessible to anyone willing to look, and look they did. The experiment, as Vault Tech intended, was to see whether a successfully recovering addict community would relapse when presented with sudden access. How long would the rehabilitation hold? What would the social dynamics look like when the supply reappeared? The answer came quickly. The vault destroyed itself within days. The gunners, the mercenary group, eventually moved in, which tells you roughly how complete the destruction was. Mystery 22, Vault 68, and Vault 69. The ones we never visited. Both vaults appear only in cut content and supplementary material, specifically the Fallout Bible, the design document compilation published by the original development team. They represent experiments so blunt in their social engineering that they didn't even bother with a cover story. Vault 68, 1,000 residents, 999 men, 1 woman. Vault 69, 1,000 residents, 999 women, 1 man. The game never takes you inside either vault. The Fallout Bible notes their designs without speculating on their outcomes. What the developers decided, and this might be the most interesting creative choice associated with these vaults, is that whatever happened inside them is left entirely to your imagination. No records, no survivors, no environmental storytelling. Just the mathematical fact of those ratios and 200 years of a sealed space. Mystery 23, Vault 114 and Soup Canheri. Vault 114 appears in Fallout 4's Unlikely Valentine quest, and on the surface it seems like a fairly straightforward abandoned vault. But if you read the terminal entries from its design committee, you discover that this vault was supposed to house Boston's wealthiest and most powerful pre-war elite people who normally would have received VIP vault access through their corporate connections. The idea was to take people utterly accustomed to luxury and comfort and place them in the smallest, most poorly outfitted vault in the region. The selected overseer was a man known colloquially as Soup Canheri, a description that communicates everything you need to know about his relationship to the vault's intended population. The terminal entries document an increasingly frantic pre-war Vault Tech selection committee trying to make the choice of overseer look accidental and natural, while internally acknowledging that they were deliberately selecting the most annoying, least competent, most ideologically misaligned overseer they could find. The vault was never actually completed or occupied. Boston's elite presumably had other options when the bombs fell. But the design itself is a fascinating document of what the engineers behind these experiments were actually trying to measure: the specific texture of class friction when the power dynamics were suddenly inverted. Mystery 24, Vault 22 and the Plants That Won. Vault 22, in the Mojave Wasteland, was the Green Vault. The experiment was about sustainable agriculture. The vault was populated entirely with botanists, agricultural scientists, and their families. Their mission was to develop new strains of plants capable of surviving in post-war conditions. The vault had extensive greenhouse systems. The research was real and serious and potentially valuable. The spores were not part of the plan. A fungal mutation developed somewhere in Vault 22's experimental crops, something that the researchers documented with escalating alarm across the terminal entries. The spores were capable of colonizing human tissue. People who inhaled them experienced behavioral changes before eventually converting into something that was no longer quite what they had been. The plants didn't just grow, they grew through the vault's population. By the time you arrive in New Vegas, Vault 22 is filled with plant monsters and the evidence of what might have been a genuinely important agricultural research program, all of it now tangled with roots and converted bodies. One researcher, Dr. Hildern, is still obsessed with recovering the vault's research data, driven by the potential applications of what was discovered there, and he sends you in with very vague information about what you're going to find. The data he wants does exist. Its value is real. The question the quest leaves open is whether scientific progress derived from an experiment that killed everyone involved is progress worth wanting. Mystery 25, Vault 118, and the murder that wasn't. Vault 118, in Far Harbor's DLC area, was designed for an unusual social experiment. The wealthiest individuals in pre-war America paired deliberately with working-class staff who would serve them. The idea was to study class dynamics within a closed community over an extended period. The vault never fully filled before the bombs fell, so what you find is a small population of incredibly wealthy robots, robo-brains, into which the minds of the vault's original wealthy residents were uploaded, and a handful of human maintenance staff, kept in cryogenic suspension for decades. The murder mystery at the center of Vault 118's quest involves a dead robo-brain, a disputed motive, and a set of suspects whose pre-war wealth has not exactly made them more honest. The solution involves piecing together social dynamics that predate the war by centuries. These people's grievances are older than the apocalypse. They kept their rivalries even when their brains were placed in metal bodies in an underground vault. The mystery has a solution, but the vault's broader question, what happens to class resentment when the class distinctions are preserved artificially through technology, even as the world that gave those distinctions meaning ceases to exist, is left open? Section 4. Ghosts in the Static Radio Signals and Broadcast Mysteries. There is something uniquely appropriate about using radio as Fallout's primary mechanism for mystery. Radio waves travel through walls. They persist longer than the buildings they originate from. A transmission broadcast in 2077 might still be transmitting in 2277, because the equipment is still running on nuclear power in some bunker somewhere that no one has found yet. The post-war wasteland is full of voices talking to no one, messages intended for recipients who never arrived, and signals that mean something but whose meaning has been lost to time. Fallout 3 was particularly rich with this kind of ambient mystery. The Capital Wasteland's radio spectrum was crowded with strange broadcasts, each one pointing toward a location, a person, a story. You could turn your Pip-Boy into a divining rod for other people's disasters. Mystery 26. Signal Oscar Zulu. Signal Oscar Zulu is a distress broadcast playing somewhere in the Capital Wasteland, and when you triangulate its source and follow it, you find a building with a man named Bob Anderstein, who has been broadcasting a plea for help. He mentions his sick child. He says he needs medicine. He says he's waiting for someone to come. Bob Anderstein is dead when you arrive. He's been dead for a long time. His child is not in the building. There is no small skeleton, which the community has noted for years as quietly significant. Did the child survive? Did someone come before you? Did they leave together? Was Bob already gone when help arrived? The signal is still broadcasting. The message is still playing. He's still asking for help in a voice that echoes through empty rooms, long after the outcome, whatever it was, has already been decided. Mystery 27. Signal Sierra Romeo. This one leads you to a Chinese espionage outpost in the Capital Wasteland, a reminder that the Cold War was very much still hot in Fallout's timeline when the bombs fell, and that China had intelligence operatives embedded in the United States. The signal itself is in Chinese, which the Pip-Boy translates, and it reads as a check-in from an agent who doesn't know the war has ended, or perhaps knew and kept transmitting anyway. The outpost contains the remnants of a spy operation, equipment, encoded messages, supply caches. The agent who was stationed there is presumably long dead, but the signal plays on, automated, still checking in, still following protocol for a mission that ended over 200 years ago. There's something about this that Fallout 3 almost never draws attention to explicitly. The war didn't end with a treaty or a ceasefire. It ended because everyone on both sides stopped being alive. The Chinese operators and the American civilians died together, simultaneously, in the same 2 hours. The Cold War didn't have a conclusion. It had an interruption so large it made conclusions irrelevant. Mystery 28, the number station in Fallout, New Vegas. If you tune to certain frequencies in the Mojave Wasteland and listen carefully, you can pick up what can only be described as a number station, the real-world Cold War phenomenon, where intelligence agencies broadcast strings of numbers and letters to field agents in code that only they could decode. The Fallout number stations repeat their sequences on loops, unchanged, automated. No quest acknowledges them. No NPC comments on them. They're just broadcasting endlessly to recipients who are certainly dead, in a code that almost certainly can't be cracked by any living entity in the wasteland. The fan community has made repeated attempts to decode the sequences and find consistent results, with limited success. Some appear to reference coordinates. Some appear to reference dates. None have been confirmed as pointing to anything significant, which is either because they don't mean anything, or because what they mean hasn't been found yet. Mystery 29. Mr. New Vegas and the AI Who Cares. Radio New Vegas is the Mojave's entertainment broadcast, hosted by the charming and impossibly smooth Mr. New Vegas. He introduces songs, makes cheerful observations about life in the wasteland, reads listener mail, and generally maintains the kind of breezy professional composure that suggests either complete psychological resilience or no psychology at all. He's an AI. Pre-war software, running on hardware that has somehow maintained itself for over 2 centuries, broadcasting into the wasteland for an audience that ranges from a handful of people at any given time to possibly no one. A Bethesda developer confirmed him as an invention of Mr. House, a product of the same mind that built the Lucky 38 and the Securitron Army and all the other infrastructure that kept New Vegas running after the bombs. What's interesting about Mr. New Vegas is what his existence implies about Robert House. House is obsessive about outcomes. He plans for centuries. Everything he builds has a function in his larger strategy. So, what's the function of an AI disc jockey who plays swing music and makes gentle jokes about rad scorpions? The most compelling theory is that Mr. New Vegas isn't infrastructure. He's sentiment. He's the version of Robert House that wanted things to be beautiful for their own sake, expressed through the only channel where beauty could exist independent of strategic utility. 200 years of good music playing for anyone who bothered to listen. That theory is not confirmed anywhere in the game's text, but it fits. Mystery 30. The emergency broadcast in Fallout 4. Diamond City Radio is the Commonwealth's equivalent of Radio New Vegas, run by a live DJ named Travis Miles, whose arc over the course of the game involves him gaining the confidence to stop mumbling into the microphone and start actually connecting with his audience. But occasionally, Diamond City Radio goes quiet. And when it does, there's another signal you can pick up. An emergency broadcast system loop that dates to the 23rd of October 2077, the day the bombs fell. The broadcast is still going, 210 years later, instructing citizens of the Boston area to proceed to designated shelter locations and stay calm and await further instructions. Further instructions have not come. The broadcast itself is a standard EBS format. It tells you nothing specific about who authorized it, or when it was cut off, or whether anyone was still alive to see its message out. What it tells you is that at some point on October 23rd, someone hit the button that started the loop, and then everything that was supposed to follow, that the management of an orderly evacuation, the coordination of emergency response, the restoration of order stopped. The button got pressed, the loop started, and then whatever human chain of events was supposed to follow just didn't happen. The loop kept going anyway, for 210 years, still telling people to stay calm, still telling them help is coming. Mystery 31. Fallout 3's Ghoul radio station. Tucked into the capital wasteland is a small settlement accessible mainly through a specific quest chain, and connected to it is a ghoul radio station, whose host is a pre-war ghoul, someone who survived the bombs and the centuries that followed, and who now broadcasts music and news from behind the safety of a fortified bunker. What makes this station interesting is the playlist. The Ghoul DJ plays pre-war music, as you'd expect. But the selections he makes are specific, and fans have noted that they seem to be curated around a theme of loss and displacement. Songs about missing people, about distance, about the passage of time. Whether this is a deliberate characterization choice by the writers or simply the songs that happen to be available in Fallout 3's soundtrack, the effect is the same. a voice that has been alive for over 200 years, choosing music that maps to things he can't say directly about his own experience. No quest ever gives him a history. You can listen to his broadcasts indefinitely without ever learning what he survived or who he lost or why he's still talking to anyone who'll tune in. Mystery 32, the Marigold Station Broadcast. In Fallout 3, beneath the ruins of a DC metro system that is terrifying to navigate under the best of circumstances, there is a signal broadcasting from somewhere in the Marigold Station area. Following the signal leads you through stretches of darkness populated by fire ants that have been enhanced by a pre-war experiment modified to be larger, faster, and capable of spitting fire. The signal itself is from a scientist who was conducting the ant modification experiment and who is, depending on when you encounter him, either still alive in the tunnels or recently deceased. His holotapes and terminal entries document the experiment with the kind of enthusiasm that comes just before catastrophic professional regret. He was trying to develop an agricultural application ants that could defend crops against pests, and the results are currently eating people in the metro system. The mystery is less about the experiment itself and more about the broadcast. Why was he still sending a signal out from inside a fire ant nest? The answer the holotapes suggest is that he'd been in there long enough that he'd stopped distinguishing between the signal going out and the signal being received. He was broadcasting because that's what the equipment was for. The distinction between communication and crying into a void had ceased to matter. Mystery 33, the Morse code in the mountains. Fallout 76 adds a new layer to the Wasteland radio tradition with a handful of signals in Appalachia that appear to be in Morse code. Some of them decode to coordinates, some decode to what appear to be names. One decodes to something that multiple players spent considerable time trying to corroborate before concluding it was either a reference to a development in-joke or a placeholder that was never replaced. The Morse code signals in 76 tie into the game's broader theme of secrets left behind by pre-war intelligence operations and private corporate research programs, all of which ran in Appalachia because the terrain was good cover. But they also fit the series' habit of using radio as a mechanism for mystery, the idea that the wasteland is full of messages that were sent out and never received, conversations that never completed, communications that are still happening in the electromagnetic sense, even though all parties are long dead. Section 5. The Institute's Shadow and its Unanswered Questions. The Institute is the primary antagonist of Fallout. 4 inches structural terms, the faction whose actions drive the Commonwealth's central conflict, whose existence has destabilized the region, and whose laboratories under the surface of the CIT ruins represent the most technologically advanced human enterprise in the game's setting. And yet, for an organization that serves as the story's central mystery, enormous amounts of what it actually does and what it actually wants remain genuinely unclear even after you complete the game's main quest. Mystery 34. What the Institute actually wants. Ask anyone at the Institute what their goal is and they'll tell you, every single time, the betterment of mankind. The phrase is a verbal reflex for them, the equivalent of a corporate mission statement repeated so often it has stopped having meaning. But if you press them, if you push past the slogan and ask them to be specific, the specificity never quite arrives. The Institute has developed Gen 3 synths, fully biological, fully conscious artificial humans, indistinguishable from the real thing. They've replaced people throughout the Commonwealth with synths. They've abducted individuals for research. They've maintained absolute secrecy about their location and operations for over a century. They have access to technology that could solve the Commonwealth's water problems, its radiation problems, its food security problems. They haven't done any of that. What they've done instead is pursue a research agenda that is never made transparent even after you join them. The betterment of mankind is the stated goal. The method replacing surface humans with synthetic humans, slowly, covertly, is never explained to your satisfaction. When you push Father, who runs the Institute, on why they don't just use their technology to help the Commonwealth, his answer is essentially that the surface people are a lost cause. That is not a scientific position. That is a judgment. And the game never interrogates whether that judgment is ideological, personal, or something else entirely. Mystery 35. Where did Zimmer go? In Fallout 3, there is a quest called The Replicated Man that introduces the Institute obliquely through a character named Dr. Zimmer. He's an Institute scientist who has traveled to the capital Wasteland specifically to retrieve an escaped synth, a Gen 2 unit that has made it all the way from the Commonwealth to Rivet City and built a life there. Zimmer is cold, condescending, and completely certain of his right to reclaim Institute property regardless of that property's wishes. In Fallout 4, set 4 years after the events of Fallout 3, Zimmer is listed in Institute records as missing. He was last assigned to a high-profile retrieval mission. His current status is unknown. An Institute administrator named Io, when asked about Zimmer, gives an answer that is carefully worded to be uninformative. The high-profile units he was supposedly retrieving, coursers, according to the most popular theory, are the Institute's most dangerous synthetic assets. If something went wrong on a mission retrieving coursers, the Institute would have every reason to keep that information quiet. Coursers failing would be an enormous embarrassment. Coursers turning on their handlers would be an existential threat. Zimmer's fate is never explained. The record sits in the Institute files as an administrative ghost. Someone who existed, who was given an assignment, and who stopped existing. The gap in the bureaucracy is the only marker of whatever happened to him. Mystery 36. What is Kellogg? Conrad Kellogg, the mercenary who kidnaps Sean in Fallout 4's opening, is one of the game's most compelling supporting characters precisely because the more you learn about him, the less you understand. He's been alive for well over a century thanks to Institute Cybernetics, a series of technological augmentations that have extended his lifespan and enhanced his capabilities far beyond normal human limits. He was born on the West Coast. He made his way to the Commonwealth. He became the Institute's primary surface operative. The Dangerous Minds quest gives you access to Kellogg's memories replayed through Nick Valentine's neural systems with the help of a psychic's technology. In those memories, you see Kellogg's history in fragments. A violent childhood, a relationship with a woman who was killed, the loss of a daughter, a life constructed around the avoidance of loss by becoming someone who causes loss to others before they can cause it to him. Then there's a moment at the end of the memory sequence where Kellogg briefly, impossibly, seems to speak through Nick Valentine directly. Not a memory, something current. He seems to be aware that you're in his memories. He seems to be addressing you. This moment is never explained. The writers have not confirmed what it was supposed to represent. Residual memories in Nick's system? Something about Nick's own neural architecture? Something about Kellogg's cybernetics persisting in an electronic sense after his death? The game moves on immediately after, and no character ever references the moment. Mystery 37. The Gen 3 synth threshold. At what point does a synth become a person? The Institute never asks this question, which is itself informative. Their internal culture categorizes Gen 3 synths as property from the moment they're created, regardless of how biologically complete they are, regardless of the fact that they are indistinguishable from humans in every measurable sense, regardless of what self-awareness they develop over time. The designation synthetic functions as a legal and cultural firewall that allows the Institute's researchers to do things to Gen 3 synths that they would never consider doing to humans. Nick Valentine, a Gen 3 synth loaded with the memories of a pre-war detective, is clearly self-aware, clearly capable of genuine relationships, clearly capable of suffering. He knows he is a synth. He is at peace with it. But the memories he carries, the memories that make him feel like a specific person rather than a general category of object, were taken from a human being without that human being's consent, installed in a synthetic body, and sent out into the world to collect data for the Institute. The human whose memories form the foundation of Nick Valentine's identity is presumably dead. Nick is the only continuation of those memories that exists. Whether that means Nick is that person in any philosophically meaningful sense, or whether it means something more complicated, is a question the game asks and deliberately refuses to answer. Mystery 38. The Railroad's complete history. The Railroad is the oldest active organization in the Commonwealth at the time of Fallout, far older than the Minutemen in their current form, older certainly than the Brotherhood's arrival in the region. Their stated purpose is to help synths escape the Institute and achieve freedom. But the Railroad's own history is almost completely opaque. Their headquarters is a church that was a stop on the original Underground Railroad before the war, a detail that is acknowledged in a single terminal entry and then essentially dropped. Their founding date is unclear. Their original leadership is documented only in fragments. There have been multiple catastrophic purges, times when the Institute's coursers have torn through the organization and killed most of its members, requiring a complete rebuild from scratch. Desdemona, who leads the railroad in 2287, knows the history but shares only pieces of it. The organization's records are maintained in coded form that requires specific tools to decrypt. There are hints of internal debates that occurred before the current leadership about the ethics of what they were doing, about whether helping synths escape constituted the full scope of their obligation or merely a first step. The railroad is presented as a resistance organization, but the full history of what they've resisted and what it's cost them, and what ideological battles have been fought internally about the correct approach to synthetic freedom, remains largely in shadow. Mystery 39. Who built the Institute's teleporter? The Institute's teleportation technology used by coursers and eventually accessible to the player is presented as the peak of their engineering achievement. But the history of who developed it, when, and under what circumstances is never fully documented. The early institute was a research institution descended from MIT's post-war successor, focused primarily on robotics and basic survival technology. The jump from that to functional teleportation represents an enormous leap. The records that exist suggest the teleporter was developed sometime in the middle of the Institute's history, decades before the events of Fallout 4. But who specifically led the project? What theoretical framework they were working from? And whether there were failed prototype attempts that cost lives? None of this is documented in the accessible terminals. There's a hint in one researcher's personal log that the teleporter project required more than was budgeted for in terms of human cost. No specifics are given. The log was clearly not intended to be found. Mystery 40. Father's real feelings. Father, the name given to Sean, the sole survivor's son, who has become the Institute's director, is perhaps Fallout 4's most psychologically interesting NPC. He's simultaneously the baby you watched get kidnapped in the prologue and the old man who has spent his entire adult life running the organization responsible for the Commonwealth's misery. He genuinely believes in what the Institute is doing. He's also clearly, in certain moments, aware that belief isn't the same as being right. The mystery of Father is the mystery of what he actually feels about you. He returns your memories to you. He engineers your awakening. He makes you his successor. He dies knowing you'll continue his work. But he also built the systems that abducted you from Cryo without your consent, that used your genetic material to create himself, that caused you to live your post-war life as a pawn of someone else's agenda even before you were fully awake. Does he love you? Does he recognize the violence of what was done to you? Does he understand that the relationship you have now, in which you are expected to feel gratitude and continuity towards someone who is simultaneously your child and your captor, is not a normal parent-child dynamic? The game doesn't answer. Father dies. What was going on inside him goes with him. The journal entries he leaves you are affectionate, but affection and honesty are not the same thing, and Father was trained from birth to be very good at one and selective with the other. Section 6. Ancient Evils Pre-War Secrets Buried Deep. Every Fallout game rewards the player who digs into the pre-war history of a location. The governments and corporations and secret programs that operated in the decades before the 23rd of October, 2077, were doing things they kept very carefully hidden. And 2 centuries of rubble is not always sufficient to keep those secrets buried. Sometimes they're more buried than ever, accessible only through specific sequences of terminal entries that require reading across multiple buildings in the same area. Sometimes they surface as mutations or phenomena with no obvious explanation. Sometimes they take the form of buildings that don't match any public record. Mystery 41. The Mariposa Military Base and what Five was actually supposed to do. Mariposa Military Base in California, the setting of much of the original Fallout's mid-game, was where the forced evolutionary virus was refined and tested on military prisoners. The surface story, the one Vault-Tec and the military collaborated on for public consumption, was that FEV was a potential cure for a plague that had been ravaging the American population. Something called the New Plague, a respiratory disease that emerged in the 2050s and killed a significant portion of the workforce before a vaccine was developed. The FEV cure story was a cover for the Super Soldier Project, but the Fallout lore layers additional complexity on top of this. FEV wasn't just about making soldiers stronger. The research had a longer arc that involved potential genetic manipulation at a population level, using the virus as a vector for controlled evolution. The Enclave, in their planning for a post-war American Renaissance, saw FEV as a tool for managing the gene pool of whoever they allowed to survive. The question that the first two games raise but never fully answer is how long the Enclave had been planning this. The FEV project predates the Enclave's post-war consolidation, which means the planning for what to do after the war began before anyone was certain there would be a war. At some point, someone in the chain of command stopped treating nuclear conflict as a risk to be prevented and started treating it as a variable to be factored in. Mystery 42, the Sierra Madre and what really happened. The Sierra Madre, the setting of Fallout, New Vegas's Dead Money DLC, is a pre-war luxury casino that was never officially opened. Its founder, Frederick Sinclair, built it in the Sonoran Desert as a gift for a woman named Vera Keyes, who was herself involved in circumstances she didn't fully understand. The casino was meant to be a paradise, lavish, isolated, completely self-contained. Then the cloud appeared. A heavy, toxic gas that carries particulate matter capable of killing anyone exposed to it for extended periods. The cloud fills the Sierra Madre's surrounding area to such density that approaching the casino requires careful navigation and timing. The casino's automated systems, including an army of ghost people, hazmat-suited figures who have essentially fused with their suits over generations of exposure, continue to function long after the casino's intended opening. The mystery of the Sierra Madre revolves around several questions. First, where did the cloud come from? The official explanation of Vault-Tec chemical experiment gone wrong is hinted at but never confirmed. Second, what exactly are the ghost people? Were they once vault dwellers? Construction workers? Tourists? Their relationship to the cloud has been going on for long enough that they've lost human behavioral patterns entirely while retaining something enough like survival instinct to make them dangerous. Third, what was Sinclair really building? And for whom? The casino was a love letter, but the underground bunker systems beneath it were clearly designed for a post-war scenario that Sinclair had anticipated in some detail. He was preparing for something specific. The materials he stockpiled, the systems he designed, the messages he left for Vera, they mapped to a mind that knew more than he should have about what was coming. Mystery 43, The Divide and What the Courier Did. Lonesome Road, the final DLC for Fallout New Vegas, introduces the location called The Divide, a stretch of the American Southwest that was once a vibrant community, a major settlement that predated the NCR's eastward expansion. It was destroyed by a nuclear detonation triggered by a delivery package, a package carried there by the courier before the events of the main game. Ulysses, the DLC's primary antagonist and one of the game's most elaborately developed characters, believes the courier destroyed the Divide deliberately. The historical record, as reconstructed through the DLC's terminal entries and holotapes, suggests the courier was acting as a delivery person in good faith and had no way of knowing the package contained a nuclear detonator linked to the Divide's dormant missile silos. But Ulysses doesn't fully believe that, and the game doesn't fully dispel his interpretation. The courier's pre-game history is, by design, almost entirely blank, a deliberate choice to preserve player projection. But Lonesome Road introduces a specific history for the courier that predates the main story and that has consequences, and the question of what the courier actually knew and intended in that earlier life is one the DLC deliberately leaves open. What happened in the Divide is documented. Why it happened, what chain of causation ran from someone hiring the courier to the missiles going up is not. Mystery 44, The Enclave's Full Reach. The Enclave is Fallout's persistent shadow government, the remnants of the pre-war American federal establishment that survived the bombs in purpose-built fortifications and have spent the post-war centuries maintaining their belief in their right to rule. They appear as primary antagonists in Fallout 2 and Fallout 3, are referenced in New Vegas, and show up in 76 and the TV show. What's never been fully mapped is the extent of their network. The Enclave clearly had multiple installations across the United States. There are confirmed East Coast and West Coast chapters, and the TV show implies an ongoing Los Angeles chapter as of 2,296. But the full inventory of their bunkers, their research programs, and their personnel has never been presented. There are hints scattered across the games of Enclave activities that don't fit neatly into the established narrative. Research programs that seem to have operated without connection to the known Enclave leadership. Installations that were clearly Enclave in design, but that show no record of contact with the organization's command structure. Whether these represent deliberate decentralization, or wartime fragmentation that was never repaired, or something more complicated, possibly including rogue elements, is never clarified. Mystery 45. The Prydwen's construction history. The Brotherhood of Steel's airship, the Prydwen, is one of Fallout 4's most impressive pieces of set design. It docks at Boston Airport and serves as the Brotherhood's mobile headquarters throughout the game. Elder Maxon commands from it. The scribes keep the Brotherhood's records there. What's less clear is how the Prydwen was built. When, by whom, and with what resources. Brotherhood chapters are described as having limited manufacturing capacity. They rely heavily on pre-war tech and salvaged components. Building an airship of the Prydwen's scale from scratch in the post-war wasteland would require materials and engineering expertise that the Brotherhood's known capabilities don't obviously support. Terminal entries reference construction delays, material sourcing difficulties, and engineering problems during the Prydwen's construction. But the full timeline from concept to completion and the full accounting of what it cost the Brotherhood in resources and personnel to build it is never laid out. The airship exists as an accomplished fact impressive, imposing, visually dominant, and its backstory is left for the reader to infer. Mystery 46. The fort's real purpose. Caesar's Fort in New Vegas, the Legion's command base, built on the site of a pre-war museum complex, has layers of pre-war history that the quest content never fully addresses. The museum was dedicated to Hoover Dam. The dam itself is the centerpiece of the game's strategic conflict, but the specific location of Caesar's Fort, directly overlooking the Colorado River and positioned with clear sightlines to multiple critical transit points, suggests it was chosen with a strategic awareness that goes beyond a simple, it's a good defensive position. Caesar himself is a very specific kind of thinker, a former member of the Followers of the Apocalypse, trained in history and philosophy, who built an empire modeled on the Roman Republic. He didn't choose the fort by accident, but the specific reasons for its location, whether they involve pre-war documents he found, maps he acquired, intelligence he gathered about the region's infrastructure, are never explained. The history of what the museum was, what it contained, and what information might have been stored there that Caesar found useful is entirely absent from the game's text. Section 7. Creatures without explanation. The wasteland is full of things that should not exist. Deathclaws that appear to have been engineered with precision rather than mutated haphazardly. Creatures that display behavioral complexity well beyond what their radiation-mutated biology should support. Things that turn up in locations they have no business being in, doing things that don't correspond to any documented behavioral pattern. Fallout is very good at leaving the monster just beyond the reach of complete understanding. Mystery 47. What are Deathclaws? Really? The official Fallout lore has an answer for this, and it's not the one most players would guess on first encounter. Deathclaws were engineered before the war as a replacement for human soldiers the U.S. Military's attempt to create a creature that could be deployed into combat without the logistical complications of human personnel. They were derived from Jackson's chameleon lizards, modified through a combination of FEV exposure and direct genetic engineering. The question is what happened to them after that. The Deathclaws that appear in the post-war wasteland are significantly more sophisticated than any pre-war engineering record would suggest they should be. Some, as encountered in Fallout 2, are fully sapient, capable of speech and complex thought. The MODOK Deathclaws raise families, protect their young, and communicate at a level that should be impossible for creatures designed to be weapons. How did engineered weapons become parents? The usual explanation is continued FEV exposure in the post-war environment, combined with generational mutation. But the degree of cognitive development in the intelligent Deathclaws is remarkable enough that researchers in the Fallout universe study them specifically as an anomaly. There's no complete model for how FEV plus radiation plus time equals sapience, and the game's developers never provided one. Mystery 48. The Mirelurk Queen's Intelligence. Mirelurks, the crab, lobster, human hybrids that populate every water-adjacent area in Fallout are generally treated as dangerous wildlife. Large, aggressive, armored, but ultimately animal. The queens, however, behave in ways that are harder to classify. They appear to coordinate other Mirelurks. They appear to make strategic decisions about defense. They appear to learn from encounters in ways that standard Mirelurk behavior patterns don't predict. This could simply be the game's AI giving them more complex behaviors for variety. But within the fiction, it raises questions about what degree of intelligence Mirelurk queens actually possess, and whether the just animals classification the Wasteland assigns them is accurate. Mystery 49. The Glowing Sea's Interior. Fallout 4's Glowing Sea, the heavily irradiated area southwest of Boston, the epicenter of the nuclear impact, is one of the game's most atmospheric locations, and also one of its least explored in terms of lore. It's dangerous. It's remote. It's full of feral ghouls and deathclaws and radiation so thick that normal protective gear is insufficient. But it's also full of structures. Pre-war buildings that survived the blast, partially buried by the impact, surrounded by craters and radioactive debris. There are enough structures in the Glowing Sea to suggest that this was a populated area before the war, which means there's a full pre-war history buried out there, inaccessible under the radiation, belonging to people who had nothing to do with the war and simply had the misfortune of living at the epicenter. The Glowing Sea has exactly one notable quest destination, a specific building you visit during the main quest, and then it's essentially abandoned as a narrative space. All those buried structures, all that history, none of it documented, none of it explored in any quest content. Mystery 50. The Fog of Far Harbor. The radioactive fog that covers the island in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC is presented as a natural consequence of the post-war environment. Coastal Maine, heavily radiated, with weather patterns that concentrate and retain the fallout in a low-lying marine layer. It's dangerous. It kills people over time. It supports mutant ecosystems that have adapted to the radiation it carries. But the children of Adam treat the fog as sacred. And over the course of the DLC, the fog seems to behave in ways that are hard to explain through purely natural processes. The fog appears to respond to specific locations and events. It thickens in places with emotional or historical significance. The Mother of the Fog, a figure who led the children of Adam safely through the fog to the nucleus, has never been explained to anyone's satisfaction. The most popular theories are that the Mother of the Fog is a human being using stealth technology, or a synth with specific capabilities, or a hallucination induced by long-term radiation exposure. None of these theories are confirmed. The DLC ends without addressing the question of what the Mother of the Fog actually is, and the children of Adam carry their faith into whatever future the island has. Mystery 51. The Mothman. Fallout 76's Appalachia is populated by creatures drawn from West Virginia folklore, and of all of them, the Mothman is the most carefully handled in terms of the mystery surrounding it. Unlike the Grafton Monster, FEV experiment, or the Wendigo radiation plus cannibalism mutation, the Mothman has no clean scientific origin story in the game's lore. The real-world Mothman legend originates from Point Pleasant, West Virginia sightings in 1966 and 1967 of a large, winged, red-eyed creature that was associated with the collapse of the Silver Bridge in December 1967. Whether the creature was a harbinger or a coincidence was debated at the time and has never been settled. In Fallout 76, the Mothman exists in multiple forms: the aggressive variant that attacks players, the wise Mothman that can be summoned through a specific quest and behaves passively, and the high-pitched scream variant associated with cult events. The game's lore surrounding the Mothman never assigns it a clear scientific origin. Unlike most Fallout creatures, it's not traced back to FEV experiments or radiation-induced mutation. It simply exists in Appalachia, as it apparently always has, moving through the fog and the trees with an intelligence that the game never quantifies. Mystery 52. The Sheep Squatch. The Sheep Squatch is another West Virginia cryptid incorporated into Fallout 76, and like the Mothman, it exists at an angle to the game's usual explanatory framework. The quest associated with it reveals that a specific individual, a con man, running a scheme around the creature's mythology, is ultimately responsible for a physical manifestation of the sheep squatch in the game world. But the creature has been part of Appalachian folklore for longer than any single human lifetime. Whether the game is suggesting that the sheep squatch is entirely a fabrication that happens to have a real monster accidentally associated with it, or whether the folklore and the FEV-derived creature have a more complicated relationship is deliberately left unclear. Mystery 53. The Yao Guai's pack behavior. Yao Guai are Fallout's post-war bears, heavily mutated, aggressive, dangerous, and present in significant numbers across both the Capital Wasteland and the Commonwealth. What's strange about them, and what few players pay attention to, is that they occasionally display coordinated behavior that goes well beyond what you'd expect from a territorial predator. Multiple Yao Guai in specific locations appear to cooperate in ways that look strategic, one driving prey toward others, flanking behavior, apparent awareness of each other's positions. Some of this is AI pathfinding, but the specific locations where this behavior appears most pronounced seem to correspond to areas with high background FEV contamination, which raises the question of whether prolonged FEV exposure has affected their cognitive architecture the same way it affected the MODOK death claws in Fallout 2. Mystery 54. The Super Mutant Memory. The super mutants of the Capital Wasteland created through Vault 87's FEV exposure program have lost all memory of their human past. The transformation is apparently complete enough that no echo of the person they were survives. They know they were once human in a general sense, but can access no specific memory of their lives before. Marcus, the super mutant who appears in Fallout 2 and New Vegas, is an exception. He was converted long before the Mariposa strain mutants and retains more cognitive complexity than the Vault 87 variants. He's aware of this and has specific memories of his pre-conversion life that he references in dialogue. What's never explained is why the memory wipe is complete for Vault 87 mutants but partial or absent for other conversion strains. Whether it's the specific FEV variant used, the conversion method, the subject's pre-existing neurological makeup, or something about the Vault 87 environment, the game never addresses. Marcus exists as an exception that the rule doesn't account for. Section 8. Characters who don't add up. Some of Fallout's most interesting mysteries aren't about places or creatures. They're about specific people, NPCs, whose backstories contain gaps that the game never fills, whose stated histories don't quite line up, whose behavior hints at depths of motivation that the available dialogue never excavates. These are the characters you finish talking to and find yourself still thinking about, not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. Mystery 55. Who is the mysterious stranger? The mysterious stranger is the most enduring, unexplained presence in the entire Fallout series. He has appeared in every mainline game Fallout 1, 2, 3, New Vegas, 4, 76, and in each game he remains unexplained. He is a man in a trench coat and fedora who appears only during VATS encounters, fires his weapon with inhuman precision, and then disappears before you can look directly at him. He cannot be killed. He cannot be followed. He cannot be engaged in conversation. Nick Valentine in Fallout 4 has a dedicated case file on the mysterious stranger. He's been investigating the stranger's appearances in the Commonwealth and the Capital Wasteland, but characterizes his presence in the West New Vegas and earlier as old rumors. He has theories, but no certainty. Fallout 3's official game guide describes the stranger as an odd and eldritch entity language that is clearly mythologizing, but that also gestures toward the possibility of something genuinely non-human. The Fallout 4 community has identified that the mysterious stranger and Nick Valentine share a jacket design, the same brand of cigarettes, Grey Tortoise, findable through console commands, also associated with the Institute, and a visual aesthetic that overlaps significantly. The leading theories. He is a synth created by the Institute for an unknown purpose. He is a member of a generational order that has maintained the stranger identity across centuries, with each individual inheriting the costume and the mission. He is a divine or semi-divine being whose existence operates outside the game's normal logic. He is the descendant of a single pre-war individual who somehow survived to the present day through means the game declines to explain. None of these theories is confirmed. The mysterious stranger exists as a feature of the game's fabric, a kindness that appears without explanation and vanishes without trace. And whatever his nature, Nick Valentine has been investigating him for years and is no closer to an answer. Mystery 56. What happened to Joshua Graham before New Canaan? Joshua Graham, the Burned Man, the Malpais Legate, the Apostle of the Lord, is one of Fallout, New Vegas's most memorable characters. He was once Caesar's closest ally, the co-founder of Caesar's Legion and its most feared military commander. When he was defeated at the First Battle of Hoover Dam, Caesar ordered him burned and thrown into the Grand Canyon. He survived, because, as he tells you, I had to. His survival of that ordeal is not explained. His wounds were severe enough that his entire body was wrapped in white bandages at the time of Honest Heart's events, 2 years after New Vegas. He was clearly in constant pain. He was also clearly functional in a physical sense that bordered on the superhuman. The religious framework he provides, he is now a devout Latter-day Saint. Spreading the word of God among the tribal peoples of Zion Canyon is genuine and not ironic. He believes his survival was divine intervention. The game presents this belief with respect rather than skepticism. Whether it intends the player to share or question that interpretation is deliberately left open. What happened to Joshua Graham in the years between the Grand Canyon and New Canaan? The game doesn't say. What state he was in when he arrived? Who helped him? What he was before he was the burned man, because the historical record only goes back to his Legion years and his life before that is essentially blank. He emerged into history fully formed as Caesar's right hand, which means there's a whole human life that predates the character the game gives you. Mystery 57. Ulysses and the Marked Men. Ulysses is the courier's shadow in Fallout. New Vegas, the figure that haunts the game's margins, referenced obliquely throughout the main game before appearing in the Lonesome Road DLC as the final confrontation. He was the original Courier 6 who refused the chip delivery. He has a history in the Divide and a relationship to the Courier that the game deliberately constructs as a mirror image dynamic. The Marked Men are the other inhabitants of the Divide soldiers from both the NCR and Caesar's Legion, who were caught in the nuclear detonation that destroyed the settlement. The blast and the subsequent storms stripped them of skin and fused their clothing and armor to their exposed tissue. They survived. In their mutilated state, former enemies who had been trying to kill each other became something like allies, bound together by shared suffering. What's not explained is how Ulysses' ideological position evolved through his time in the Divide and his time among the Marked Men. The Ulysses you meet in Lonesome Road is consumed by grief and rage and a kind of historical thinking that treats civilizations as actors rather than collections of individuals. He talks about symbols and cycles and the meaning of flags. His philosophy is fully formed, but its origins are absent. The years between his refusal of the chip delivery and his confrontation with you in the Divide are a gap in the record. Mystery 58. Arcade Ganon's Secret. Arcade Ganon is a Fallout New Vegas companion who works with the followers of the Apocalypse and travels with the Courier if recruited. He is sardonic, intelligent, a skilled doctor, and deeply uncomfortable with his own history. That history, as you gradually discover through companion quests and high speech checks, is that he is the son of an Enclave officer, part of the remnants of the Navarro chapter, the West Coast Enclave installation that was destroyed between the events of Fallout 2 and New Vegas. What Arcade never fully explains, even in his most candid dialogue, is what he believes the Enclave actually was, and what he thinks about what it represented. He has clearly made a deliberate moral choice to reject everything his father stood for. But the specifics of what his father told him, what he witnessed as a child at Navarro, and what the decision to leave cost him emotionally are conveyed only in fragments. There's also the question of his mother, who is referenced in passing but never developed. Where she is, what happened to her, whether Arcade has any contact with her in the present, all of this is either absent from the game's text or locked behind conversational options that many players never trigger. Mystery 59. The King's Dog. The King is the leader of the Kings, the Elvis impersonating gang in Freeside, and he has a dog named Rex. Rex is a cyberdog pre-war robotic canine with organic brain components who has been with the King for as long as anyone in Freeside can remember. Rex was clearly built before the war. His brain is deteriorating. Through the quest Nothing But a Hound Dog, you can help Rex by finding a replacement brain from another cyberdog. The replacement brains available come with the personality of the dog they previously belonged to, which affects Rex's behavior after the surgery. What no one in the game explains is how Rex ended up with the King in the first place. A pre-war cyberdog surviving into 2,281 inches functional condition is remarkable. How did a gang leader in post-war Las Vegas come to possess him? The king's own history is similarly underdeveloped. He runs a faction built around an aesthetic that seems like an elaborate joke, until you realize that the king's devotion to the king's style is completely sincere, even though they don't know who Elvis Presley was. How did that cultural transmission happen? Mystery 60. Lily Bowen's family. Lily Bowen is a Nightkin, a super mutant who was part of the Master's stealth army in the original Fallout, and she appears as a potential companion in Fallout New Vegas. She is sweet, gentle, grandmotherly, and deeply confused about her own history. She has persistent memories of being human, of having grandchildren, of family life. The mystery of Lily is that her specific memories are detailed enough to be real memories of a specific person, which means she was once a specific grandmother with specific grandchildren. But the transformation into a Nightkin should have wiped those memories entirely. The survival of her human memories is presented as both a blessing and a curse. She knows who she was, which gives her a kind of identity, but she doesn't fully understand the gap between who she was and what she is. Her grandchildren, if they were real people, would long be dead. If her memories are accurate rather than confabulated, she is the last living connection to a family that has been gone for nearly 2 centuries. The game never confirms whether her specific memories are real or whether they're a product of the same psychic damage that gives her her split personality. Section 9. Cut content and developer ghosts. Every Fallout game has cut content features, quests, characters, and locations that were developed to some degree before being removed from the final build. Sometimes the cuts are clean, sometimes they're not, and the remnants of what was removed persist in the game's files, accessible through mods or console commands, hinting at a version of the game that could have been. Mystery 61. The Vault 11 Survivor. As mentioned in the Vault section, one person walked out of Vault 11 after the final confrontation. In the game's files, there is a character model for this survivor, a model that was developed for a character who was supposed to appear somewhere in the Mojave. The character was cut before the game shipped. You never meet them. The question of what someone carries out of Vault 11, someone who witnessed the full arc of the Sacrifice Protocol and who is the last living person who knows exactly what happened down there, is haunting precisely because the game prepared to answer it and then decided not to. Mystery 62. Ulysses the Companion. Ulysses was originally planned as a companion character in Fallout, New Vegas's base game. Files in the game reference him appearing at Wolfhorn Ranch, which would have made him the only companion openly supporting Caesar's Legion. He had dialogue trees. He had a location. He had a purpose in the narrative that would have been distinct from the role he eventually plays in Lonesome Road. Why was he cut? The most commonly cited reasons involve development time and narrative coherence. His backstory required the Lonesome Road DLC's events to pay off properly, and including him as a companion in the base game would have complicated that delivery. But what the cut version of Ulysses would have contributed to the player's understanding of the Legion side of New Vegas and what his companion story would have been is entirely lost. Mystery 63. The Legion's Eastern Territory. Joshua Sawyer, lead designer of New Vegas, has confirmed in interviews that the development team wanted to include more territory east of the Colorado River, the actual heart of Caesar's Legion, as explorable content. The final game leaves this area as background. You can see lights across the river at night. There are references to Legion territory in dialogue. The LOD level of detail models suggest structures and camps that would have existed in a fully developed version. What Caesar's empire actually looks like. From the inside, the towns they've conquered, the people they've enslaved, the administration of their territory is described in dialogue but never shown. The game's portrait of the Legion is one of deliberate imbalance. You see their presence in the Mojave but not their civilization. Whether that civilization would have complicated the player's relationship with them as a faction or reinforced the game's existing characterization is permanently unknown. Mystery 64. Fallout 3's excised subplot. Among the documents in the game files of Fallout 3 are references to a subplot involving Rivet City that was significantly expanded in early development and then contracted sharply in the final build. The plot seems to have involved an infiltration mission, a quest where the player would have needed to assume a false identity within Rivet City to access restricted areas or information. The technical scaffolding for this quest persists in the game. Certain NPCs have dialogue options that feel like the remnants of a trust-building or identity management system that was never fully implemented. Some terminal entries reference events that no quest actually addresses. Rivet City, as a location, feels slightly larger in structural terms than its quest content justifies. Mystery 65: The Pit's Missing History. The Pit DLC for Fallout 3 takes place in post-war Pittsburgh, which has become an industrial slave city run by a raider faction called the Pit Raiders. The area is rich in environmental detail, old steel mills, rivers of toxic waste, the architectural bones of a once significant city, but the backstory of how Pittsburgh got from nuclear rubble to functioning, if horrific industrial economy, is presented only in fragments. The Pit has clearly been organized for a long time. The infrastructure is too developed, too intentional, to be the product of a generation or two of raider improvisation. Someone planned this. Someone built the processing systems and established the labor system and made the decisions that turned a ruined city into a working factory floor. That person, or that series of decisions, is never documented in the accessible holotapes and terminal entries. The Pit exists in its current state without a clear founding history, which makes it feel less like a location with a past and more like a set. Mystery 66: The New Vegas Sewers. The New Vegas sewer system is one of the most elaborately constructed and least explained locations in the game. It connects large sections of the city, contains multiple factions and independent inhabitants, and features environmental storytelling that suggests a much longer history of use than the game's quests ever reference. Ghouls have been living in the sewers for decades. There are supply caches that predate the current occupants. There are rooms that appear to have been cleared and resettled multiple times, with the remnants of previous occupants visible under the current layer. The sewers are also more connected to the surface via specific manholes and access points than players typically discover, because there's no quest that maps the full system. Exploring them comprehensively rewards patience with an almost archaeological picture of New Vegas's underclass history. All the people who couldn't afford or access the Strip but who had to live somewhere in the shadow of its lights? Mystery 67: The Unused Companions. Both New Vegas and Fallout 4 have unused companion data in their files, characters who were developed far enough to have dialogue frameworks, scheduled quests, and personality templates before being removed. In New Vegas, this includes Betsy the Brahmin. Yes, a Brahmin was briefly going to be a companion, and a handful of human characters whose dialogue trees exist but were never connected to a spawn location. In Fallout 4, there are references to at least 2 characters who appear in early marketing materials, but were reduced to minor NPCs, or removed entirely from the final build. The dialogue framework suggests different personality archetypes than the companions who made it into the game, which means the final companion roster represents a selection from a larger intended cast. Mystery 68: The Institute's Underwater Vault. Buried in Fallout 4's cut content is a reference to a proposed underwater vault, a vault-tech installation designed for construction beneath a body of water. The concept got far enough in development to appear in the game's files, with a working name and partial design documentation before being removed from the final build. An underwater vault raises questions that no existing Fallout game has addressed. How does the vault's ventilation system function? How is the entrance designed? How does the water pressure affect the structural engineering? What experiment was it built to run? The concept is intriguing enough that its removal feels like a genuine loss, and the partial documentation in the files only amplifies what wasn't developed. Section 10: The numbers, the maps, the coordinates. Fallout is built on geography in a very specific way. The wastelands are not random landscape generators, they're versions of real places, transformed by centuries of nuclear decay. And embedded within that geography are numerical references, spatial coordinates, and cartographic details that occasionally point toward things the game's quest content doesn't acknowledge. Some of these are developer hints. Some are in-world references to classified pre-war data. Some appear to be coincidences that have generated elaborate theories in the community for over a decade. Mystery 69: The Keller Family Radio Transmissions. In Fallout 3, there is a scattered set of radio transmissions that reference the Keller family. The transmissions are fragmented pieces of a message that was deliberately broken into parts and distributed to multiple broadcast points across the Capital Wasteland. To hear the complete message, you have to find all 5 transmission points and listen to each section in sequence. The complete message, once assembled, provides the combination to a National Guard armory. It was left by a member of the Keller family for their children, a way of ensuring that if the family was separated by the bombs, the surviving members could still access the stockpile the father had prepared. The father recorded the message clearly, knowing that he might not survive. He built a scavenger hunt out of necessity, distributing the pieces widely enough that even the worst-case children alone in the wasteland, with no one to guide them, was theoretically survivable. The question the quest raises, and never answers, is whether anyone in the Keller family survived to use this information. The armory is there. The combination works. The stockpile is accessible. But whether any Keller child ever made the journey to find all 5 transmissions and put the combination together, whether this elaborate inheritance system ever served its purpose, is left completely open. Mystery 70. The Lonesome Road's Mural. In Lonesome Road, there is a mural in the Divide that appears to have been painted by Ulysses, a massive, detailed piece of visual storytelling covering an entire wall. The mural depicts historical events: the founding of the Divide, the delivery of the package, the destruction. It also depicts figures that are recognizable as the courier and as Ulysses himself. The mural was painted before Ulysses knew you would come. It was painted in anticipation, which means Ulysses was operating with such certainty about how events would unfold that he was documenting them before they happened. Whether this certainty was based on information he knew the courier would eventually come, on obsession he planned to make it happen, or on something the game is coyly gesturing toward as potentially prophetic, is never resolved. Mystery 71. Fallout 4's hidden topographical layer. If you spend enough time in the Commonwealth and pay attention to the elevation changes, there is a topographical logic to the landscape that maps closely to the actual Boston metropolitan area, much more precisely than a casual observer would notice. Certain high points in the game correspond to actual geological features in eastern Massachusetts. Certain water patterns correspond to actual river systems. The glowing sea corresponds to a specific region southwest of the city where the impact would have been most concentrated. This isn't unusual for Bethesda's design approach. They typically model their game landscapes on real-world geography, but it means that the game's environmental storytelling has a geographic accuracy layer underneath it that rewards players who know the actual geography. Certain locations that seem random turn out to be positioned at actual historically significant sites. The castle, the Minutemen's fortified base, is built on the site of the actual Fort Independence in Hull, Massachusetts. Mystery 72. The numbers on the pyramids at Fort Hagen. Fort Hagen, the fortified building where Kellogg is eventually confronted, has decorative elements on its exterior that players have noted contain embedded numerical sequences. These sequences have been interpreted as dates, coordinates, and code strings, with none of these interpretations producing results that connect to accessible content in the game. The sequences are either architectural decoration that went unnoticed until the community started cataloging every detail of the game's environment, or they're references to something the developers embedded without payoff, or they're coincidental numerical arrangements that pattern-seeking brains have turned into mysteries. The community's strong suspicion is that they're intentional, but that whatever they point to was cut from the final game. The sequences are too precise to be random, but their endpoint, if there is one, has never been found. Mystery 73. The crashed spacecraft. In Fallout 3, there is a random encounter involving a crashed alien spacecraft. The alien in question is dead. Its ship is small. There's a unique weapon, the alien blaster, and some alien power cells. The encounter is brief, and the game says nothing else about it. In Mothership Zeta, the Fallout 3 DLC, you are abducted by an alien spacecraft in orbit above Earth. The aliens aboard it are hostile and have been capturing humans for millennia. The DLC resolves with you destroying the spacecraft and escaping. What Fallout never explains is the relationship between these events. How many alien craft have been visiting Earth? For how long? What are they collecting? The Zeta DLC implies that Earth's alien visitation history is very long and that the aliens have been cataloging human history through their abductions. But the scale of that project, the aliens' motivations, and whether their activities in any way connected to or contributed to the conditions that led to the Great War are questions the game raises and never addresses. Fallout's creator Tim Kaine has expressed mixed feelings about the series' incorporation of aliens as a significant lore element. The tension between the grounded, politically rooted catastrophe of the nuclear war and the more fantastical elements introduced by the Zeta DLC has never been resolved in a way that satisfies everyone. Section 11. Loose threads across the series. Cross-game connections and the stories that refuse to end. The Fallout series spans multiple decades of real-world development time and multiple centuries of in-universe chronology. Events in one game ripple forward into later games in ways that are sometimes acknowledged and sometimes left as Easter eggs for attentive players. And occasionally, something introduced in one game generates questions that a later game answers, except that the answer creates new questions that haven't been addressed as of 2024. Mystery 74. The NCR's current state. The New California Republic, the largest and most democratic faction in Fallout's West Coast setting, appears in Fallout 2 as a rising power, and in Fallout New Vegas as a military superpower with serious internal problems. The TV show, set in 2296, 9 years after New Vegas, includes an extremely controversial moment: the apparent destruction of Shady Sands, the NCR's capital, at some point before the show begins. The destruction of Shady Sands via nuclear detonation and the apparent collapse of the NCR as a functioning government is one of the most debated lore decisions in recent Fallout history. Players who had invested heavily in the NCR as the series' closest thing to a legitimate civilization found the offhand revelation that it was gone jarring. The specific circumstances of the destruction, who ordered it, why, how recently it happened, are left vague in the show's first season. What the show doesn't address, and what is a major question for the series going forward, is where the NCR's population went. A state doesn't cease to exist because its capital is bombed. The people are still there. The infrastructure, however damaged, is still partially there. Whatever succeeded or failed to succeed the NCR's government is the most significant political question in Fallout's current timeline, and it has not been answered. Mystery 75. Robert House's pre-war knowledge. Robert House is, by his own account, the single most prescient individual in the Fallout universe. He accurately predicted the date of the nuclear exchange within 2 years, using his own calculations of global resource depletion and geopolitical tension. He used that prediction to prepare New Vegas for survival, designing the missile defense system that protected the Strip's major structures, arranging his own cryogenic preservation, and setting up the automated systems that would keep things running while he slept. He was right about almost everything. But the Fallout TV show complicates the question of House's knowledge by revealing that Vault-Tec explicitly planned to start the war. House sent a body double to the meeting where this plan was discussed, which means he had intelligence about the meeting and didn't want anyone to know he was there. Which means he knew the war was coming, in more specific terms than his calculations alone would have provided. What exactly House knew about Vault-Tec's plans, when he knew it, and what actions he took or declined to take with that knowledge. All of this sits in a gap between the games and the show that hasn't been filled. Mystery 76. The connection between the two Fallout 3 main quests. Fallout 3's main quest is nominally about purifying the Potomac River's water supply, specifically about restarting Project Purity, your father's life work. The secondary antagonists for most of the game are the Enclave, who want to add a modified FEV strain to the purified water that will kill anyone without pure DNA. The Lone Wanderer's final choice whether to activate the purifier personally and die, or send someone else seems to resolve the crisis. But the DLC Broken Steel extends the story and raises a question. The water purification project was completed, and the purified water began flowing through the capital wasteland. Did it work? The game and its DLC show the immediate aftermath but never fully commit to showing a long-term transformation of the region. In Fallout 4, which takes place in Massachusetts, there are references to the capital wasteland, but no clear picture of whether Project Purity's long-term ecological impact was what James, your father, hoped for. Whether the Lone Wanderer's sacrifice transformed the capital wasteland into something significantly more livable, whether the thing they died for mattered is never definitively answered. Mystery 77. The fate of the Enclave. After Fallout 3 ends with the apparent defeat of the East Coast Enclave. Their mobile headquarters, the Enclave-occupied Raven Rock, is destroyed. Their leader, President Eden, an AI who has been running the organization unbeknownst to most of its members, is eliminated. Their presence in the capital wasteland is effectively ended. But the Enclave did not cease to exist. The TV show, set 20 years after Fallout 4 and 30 years after Fallout 3, shows an active Enclave operation in Los Angeles. Fallout 76 shows a pre-war Enclave installation in Appalachia that is still running in 2102, staffed by the last remnants of the pre-war government. Fallout New Vegas references the West Coast Enclave's defeat at Navarro as something that happened between Fallout 2 and New Vegas. The full picture of how much of the Enclave survived, how the various chapters communicated or failed to communicate after their leadership structures collapsed, and what the organization as a whole became in the decades between Fallout 3 and the TV show is one of the most significant unresolved questions in the series' overarching lore. Mystery 78. The Boneyard and What Happened to the West. The original Fallout is set in Southern California, largely in and around the ruins of Los Angeles, called the Boneyard in wasteland parlance. By the time of Fallout 2, the new California Republic has emerged from this region and begun its northward and eastward expansion. By the time of New Vegas, the NCR is a continental power. The TV show returns to the Los Angeles area and shows a 2,296 version of the city. The gap between the Boneyard of 2,161 and the Los Angeles of 2,296 is enormous in terms of change and development. What happened there? The show gives a snapshot, but not a history. The intervening century and a half, the NCR's rise and apparent fall, the various factions that must have claimed and lost and reclaimed parts of the region, is almost entirely undocumented. Mystery 79. The Memory Den's implications. The Memory Den in Fallout 4's Goodneighbor is a service that allows clients to relive their memories through a technology that taps directly into the brain's stored experience. Dr. Amari operates it and uses it during the main quest as a tool for accessing Kellogg's memories through Nick Valentine. But the implications of the Memory Den are never explored in the main game. If memories can be accessed, recorded, and played back, then certain categories of question become answerable that would otherwise be impossible. The Memory Den is available as a commercial service, which means people use it regularly for recreational memory reliving. What's the ethical framework for a technology that makes your memories accessible to others? What happens if a memory is used as evidence, or sold, or broadcast? The game introduces this technology and then uses it instrumentally without exploring any of the cultural or ethical questions it raises. The Memory Den in 2287 is a niche service in a small settlement. 200 years later, in a world that continues to develop, it could be something else entirely. The seed of enormous questions is planted in one small niche business. Mystery 80. The China Before the War. Fallout's lore establishes China as the primary military adversary of the United States in the decades before the war. The two powers locked in a resource conflict that gradually escalated from economic competition to military confrontation in Alaska to nuclear exchange. But the Chinese perspective on these events has almost never been represented in the actual games. Chinese soldiers appear in the capital wasteland as feral ghouls, long-dead infiltrators whose mission clearly ended in the initial radiation of the war. Chinese submarines appear in the Pacific. There are Cold War-era Chinese spy outposts. But the actual civilization, the pre-war Chinese society, the political dynamics, the human experience of being on the other side is almost entirely absent. This is both a creative limitation, the games are set in America, and a genuine gap in the lore's completeness. The conflict that ended the world has only one side of its perspective documented. Whatever China's population experienced in the run-up to and during the war, whatever their government's internal deliberations were, whatever their version of the vaults, if any, looked like none of this exists in the series' accessible text. Mystery 81. The Courier's 6 Original Deliveries. The Courier in Fallout. New Vegas was on a delivery route before they were shot and buried in Goodsprings. The Mojave Express had them making multiple stops, the chip destined for Mr. House was one of 6 deliveries on the manifest. The other 5 deliveries are never described. Their contents, their recipients, their significance, if any, are unknown. The chip that started the game's conflict was specifically targeted by Benny because he was aware of its importance. Was he aware of the other deliveries? Were any of the other packages related to the political situation in the Mojave? Or were they exactly what they appeared to be? Routine courier deliveries that happened to be scheduled on the same manifest as the most important package in the region? The courier's full manifest represents a slice of the Mojave's commercial and logistical activity in 2281 that the game never examines. Most of those deliveries presumably never got made. Most of those recipients never got their packages. 5 little consequences, unseen, rippling outward from the same moment that started everything. Mystery 82. Lorenzo Cabot's Artifact. As mentioned in the section on the Commonwealth's dead, Lorenzo Cabot brought back an artifact from the Rub al Khali Desert that conferred near immortality on the Cabot family. The artifact is described as ancient beyond any known civilization's timeframe. In Fallout 4's released content, Lorenzo is encountered during the Cabot House questline. His journals reference the artifact's properties and his own attempts to understand it. But the artifact itself, the specific object, its origin, its mechanism, is never revealed. It's described. It's referenced. It sits in a room that you can enter. And then the questline ends, and the artifact's deeper nature is not addressed. The Cabot House questline was designed with a specific conclusion: either Lorenzo survives or he doesn't, depending on your choice, but neither outcome resolves the artifact question. The object that may predate all known human civilization, that can make a family immortal, is left in a room in a Fallout 4 DLC as an unresolved premise. Section 12. The final signal mysteries that may never be solved. We've covered over 80 mysteries by this point, but the last dozen or so belong to a specific category. Questions that the series has generated, that the community has debated for years, and that may simply never have answers. Not because the developers forgot about them, but because deliberate ambiguity is itself a design choice, because some doors in the wasteland are meant to stay closed, and the imagination that fills the darkness behind them is more valuable than any specific explanation would be. Mystery 83. The Fog of Appalachian Storytelling. Fallout 76 is set in 2102, only 25 years after the war. This makes it the earliest in the timeline of any Fallout game, and it means it occupies a unique position as a kind of origin story for things that appear fully formed in later games. The Brotherhood of Steel is in its infancy. The Enclave is still running active operations. The political landscape that will eventually produce the NCR and Caesar's Legion and the Institute hasn't begun to emerge yet. But there are events in Fallout 76's Appalachian timeline that clearly connect to later developments that must connect to later developments and whose connection is never explicitly drawn. The Scorched Plague that threatens Appalachia in 76's main quest is a form of FEV-related mutation linked to the Scorchbeast Queens. The Scorched Wildlife and Scorched Humans in 76 seem to share certain behavioral and biological characteristics with creatures in later games that aren't supposed to have reached those regions. Whether the Scorchbeast Plague spread, was contained, or was modified into something else by the Enclave's research before the events of Fallout 1 is one of the most significant unaddressed connections in the series' timeline. Mystery 84. The Alien Conspiracy Theory. There is a conspiracy theory among the Fallout fan community that the alien presence in the Fallout universe is larger and more integrated into the series' core lore than any single game acknowledges. Evidence cited: the aliens in Fallout 3 and Mothership Zeta have been abducting humans for centuries. The technology aboard the Zeta spacecraft includes captured human weapons and artifacts from across human history. The aliens appear to be studying humanity systematically, not randomly. Combined with the Mothership Zeta DLC's implication that the aliens have some kind of communication capability that was used in historical manipulations of human civilization, the conspiracy theory holds that the forced evolutionary virus itself may have alien origins, that whatever gave the FEV its specific properties was not purely human invention. This theory has no canonical support, but it has the virtue of being consistent with everything in the games, which is more than most grand unified theories can claim. Mystery 85. The True Nature of the Ghouls. Ghouls, humans transformed by radiation exposure into long-lived, visually deteriorated survivors, are one of Fallout's defining figures. They live for centuries. They maintain human consciousness and identity, if they don't go feral. Their relationship to radiation is inverted from normal humans. Radiation heals them rather than harming them. What the game never explains is the mechanism. The transformation from human to ghoul involves radical biological change: skin, soft tissue, neurological rewiring that cannot be produced simply by radiation poisoning on its own. The FEV is present in the capital wasteland's water and air at sufficient levels to cause mutation, and some researchers connect FEV exposure to the ghoulification process. But not all ghouls are in FEV-contaminated areas. The specific biological pathway from human to ghoul, why some people irradiated at comparable doses ghoulify while others simply die, why ghoulification produces longevity, why feralization is a risk for some ghouls but not others, and what determines that is never documented in the accessible in-game science. Mystery 86. The extraterrestrial implications of the Zetan visits. Mothership Zeta establishes that the aliens Zetans, in the fan community's terminology, have been visiting Earth for thousands of years. Among the abductees you encounter on the spacecraft, some were captured in pre-war times, one as far back as the frontier era of American history. If the Zetans have been observing Earth for millennia, then the Great War, the most significant event in recent Earth history, happened while they were watching. Did it affect their research program? Did it change what they were studying? Did any faction in the Fallout universe ever make contact with Zetans in a way that influenced the course of history? The DLC ends without addressing any of these questions. You escape. The spacecraft is destroyed. The Zetans are implied to still exist just without that particular ship. What the observer role of an alien civilization might mean for Fallout's history is a question the game introduces and then terminates by blowing up the spacecraft. Mystery 87. What happens when Fallout reaches real time? The Fallout TV show is set in 2296. The most recent games are set in the 2280s. That's less than 20 years of in-universe time between the current state of the series' media and the show's setting. As the show develops, it will presumably move the timeline forward, and as it does, it will necessarily resolve some mysteries and create others. The question of what the series' larger arc looks like, whether civilization in the wastelands eventually produces something stable, whether the post-war cycle of faction conflict and resource scarcity ever breaks, is something no game or show has yet been willing to commit to. The wasteland might be permanently in a state of becoming, or it might be heading somewhere specific. Either answer would fundamentally change the experience of the series. Mystery 88. The Children of the Cathedral's long-term plan. In the original Fallout, the Master, the super mutant collective consciousness that serves as the game's primary antagonist, has a plan for the future. Transform all of humanity into super mutants, creating a genetically uniform species that can survive in the new world without the struggle that characterizes human life. The Children of the Cathedral are his public face, a religious cult that worships him and serves as a recruitment mechanism. When you defeat the Master in Fallout 1, the cult collapses. But the Children of Adam in Fallout 3 and 4, while clearly a completely different organization with no direct connection to the Master, share a structural similarity. A cult organized around the worship of nuclear power and its transformative effects, whose long-term goal is something that would fundamentally alter human civilization. Whether this parallelism is a deliberate thematic echo or simply the coincidence of a series that returns repeatedly to the same religious territory, whether the Fallout universe has something systematic to say about the faith that emerges in nuclear environments is not a question. The games answer directly. Mystery 89. The survival of the Master's consciousness. The Master's death in Fallout 1 involves his realization that super mutants are sterile. His plan for human transformation was built on a foundation that made the transformed population non-viable over the long term. Confronted with this, he destroys himself. His physical body, his mental architecture, his telepathic network, all of it collapses. But the Master was not a conventional individual. He was, by the time of Fallout 1, a merged consciousness, a being assembled from multiple absorbed individuals whose personal histories and perspectives contributed to a composite intelligence. Whether a consciousness of that complexity can be entirely destroyed by a physical death, and whether elements of what he was persisted in any form in the survivors of his network has never been addressed. It's an extremely specific kind of question, and the answer is almost certainly No, he's dead. This is a 1997 video game. But the theoretical framework exists in the lore, and no one has ruled it out. Mystery 90. The far future of the timeline. Fallout's timeline runs from 2077 The Bombs to 2296 the TV show's current setting. The games and show have covered roughly 2 centuries of post-war history. In historical terms, that's not very long. It's the distance from the founding of the United States to the late 20th century. The post-war world is still in its infancy. What does the Fallout universe look like in another 2 centuries? Another 5? The FEV mutations are still ongoing. The political structures are still forming and collapsing. The technology gap between factions, the difference between the Institute's capabilities and a tribal community with scavenged rifles is enormous. Whether the post-war world trends toward stability or toward permanent fragmentation, whether the cycle of civilization and collapse that Fallout diagnoses as humanity's core problem is escapable, is the question the entire series is orbiting without yet committing to an answer. Mystery 91. The role of destiny in Fallout. For all of Fallout's emphasis on player choice, on the idea that the player's decisions shape the outcome, there are persistent elements in the series that push back against that emphasis. The mysterious stranger always appears at the right moment. Certain events in multiple games play out with a determinism that characters themselves acknowledge. The courier in New Vegas was shot and buried and survived, and the entire region's future turned on that survival. Whether there is a structuring logic to the wasteland, a kind of narrative gravity that pulls certain people towards certain destinies, regardless of the specific choices they make, is a metaphysical question the series keeps flirting with. Joshua Graham survived the Grand Canyon because he had to. The sole survivor woke up in 2287 instead of staying frozen indefinitely. The lone wanderer left Vault 101 at the right moment to find their father. The Fallout universe has too much overt religious content. The children of Adam, the followers of various wasteland faiths, Joshua Graham's explicitly Christian framework to be entirely secular in its cosmology. Whether any of these faiths are engaging with something real, whether there is something in the wasteland that operates with intentionality toward human beings, is never answered and probably shouldn't be. The uncertainty is the point. Mystery 92. Pickman's full story. Pickman is an artist in Fallout 4 who creates paintings using the blood of raiders, the gang members he hunts and kills across the Commonwealth. His gallery is accessible through a side quest. His work is technically impressive, thematically unsettling, and clearly the product of a mind that has processed violence into aesthetic form in ways that occupy an uncomfortable middle ground between psychosis and craft. Pickman himself explains his motivations in dialogue. He kills raiders because they harm innocent people, and he uses their remains for art because he believes it's a fitting transformation. He's functionally a vigilante with an aesthetic sensibility, but his connection to the Dunwich Borers confirmed in the Creation Club content, where Pickman explicitly links his drive to kill to his proximity to the site, raises the question of what exactly the Dunwich entity's effect on him is. Whether his violence is genuinely his own ethical position, or whether it has been amplified or redirected by something beneath the quarry, is a question the game raises by connecting these two storylines and then doesn't resolve. Mystery 93. The real history of the Mojave's water. Hoover Dam is the central strategic asset in Fallout New Vegas. Every faction in the game wants it, primarily because it means electrical power, that can run an entire region. But Hoover Dam also controls the Colorado River, which means it controls the water supply for a massive stretch of territory. The pre-war politics of water in the American Southwest are reflected in Fallout's version of the region, but the post-war water politics are never fully mapped. Who has access to the dam's water allocation? How is water managed in territories beyond the immediate Mojave? What did the original NCR do with their control of the Colorado River's flow, and what would each of the New Vegas factions do differently? Water is the single most fundamental resource in the wasteland, more important even than food or ammunition. A game built around the strategic control of a dam has enormous opportunities to explore water politics at every scale, from the individual to the civilizational. New Vegas glances at this. There are specific quests and conversations about water rights and resource allocation, but the full accounting of what Hoover Dam means for the post-war West is never drawn out. Mystery 94. The East Coast Brotherhood's long-term plans. The Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 4 has a stated purpose recovering pre-war technology and a secondary motive that Elder Maxon articulates as cleansing the Commonwealth of abominations, which in practice means super mutants, ghouls classified as feral, and synths. But the Brotherhood's long-term vision for the Commonwealth, what they intend to build, what they intend to leave behind, is never articulated. The Brotherhood doesn't colonize. They don't build settlements. They establish outposts and they recover technology and they move on. If they succeed in the Commonwealth, if the Institute is neutralized and the synth problem is resolved, what happens to the Brotherhood presence? Do they stay? Do they leave? Is there a version of the future where the Brotherhood becomes a governing institution rather than a military one? Elder Maxon seems like the kind of person who hasn't fully thought about this. He's a leader who has defined himself entirely through conflict. What he is in peacetime, if the Brotherhood ever gets there, is an unanswered question about a character whose arc ends with either victory or defeat, never with genuine institutional reflection. Mystery 95. The Memory of the Old World. The longest-running mystery in the Fallout series isn't a specific location or character or event. It's a question about cultural transmission. How does a civilization remember what it once was, across 2 centuries of catastrophe and fragmentation and violent change? The Fallout universe has ghoul characters who remember the old world directly. Nick Valentine carries pre-war memories. The Codsworth robot in Sanctuary Hills has been waiting for 200 years. Mr. House has been awake, in his medical facility, processing information about the world for the entire duration. But most people in the Wasteland have no direct memory of pre-war America. They inherit fragments through stories passed down, through pre-war media still accessible in terminals and holotapes, through the physical ruins they walk through. The Fallout world is full of people who don't know what they've lost, who don't know that the world they live in is the aftermath of something, not just the thing itself. Whether the survivors eventually produce a historical consciousness capable of learning from what happened, capable of building something that doesn't recapitulate the conditions that produced the war, is the question that sits at the center of all 6 games. None of them answer it. All of them are asking it. Mystery 96, the lingering question of the Divide. After everything Lonesome Road reveals about the Divide, the settlement that was built there, the people who live there, the Courier's role in its destruction, the location continues to exist as a physical space in the game. The Courier can walk through it after the DLC ends. The marked men are still there. The nuclear blast craters are still there. The mural is still there. But the Divide also continues in the Courier's memory and moral accounting. Ulysses frames the Courier's journey through the Divide as a kind of reckoning, not just an action sequence but a confrontation with consequence. What the Courier does with that reckoning is entirely up to the player. The game doesn't tell you whether you've processed it, whether you've found a way to carry it, whether it changes anything about how you proceed. The Divide is Fallout. New Vegas's meditation on the relationship between agency and guilt, on the question of what you owe the consequences of your actions, even when those actions were unintentional. It's not a mystery with a solution. It's a mystery that asks whether solutions are the right frame. Mystery 97. The Fate of the West Coast. After the show, the Amazon Fallout TV show's first season ends with enormous geopolitical instability. The NCR appears to be collapsed or collapsing. The Enclave is still active in some capacity. Various factions are scrambling in the power vacuum. Lucy McLean, the Vault 33 resident who serves as one of the show's protagonists, has made decisions that will have cascading effects on the region. The most pressing unanswered question, what happened to the hundreds of thousands of people who were NCR citizens? They don't simply cease to exist because Shady Sands was destroyed. They're out there. They have the institutional memory of a functioning government. They have military personnel, civil servants, farmers, merchants who built their lives within an NCR framework. What they become in the aftermath, whether they reconstitute something, fragment into factions, to get absorbed by whatever fills the power, vacuum is the central question for the show's 2nd season, and potentially for future game installments. Mystery 98. The Other Countries. Fallout's universe extends past its borders. The war was global. Other nations had their own equivalents of Vault tech, their own survival programs, their own post-war experiences. The ruins of Europe and Asia and Africa and South America contain their own 200-year histories that no game has ever explored. The fan game Fallout, London, released as a mod in 2024, is the most substantial attempt to fill this gap with a fully realized post-war British setting. It demonstrates that the Fallout framework translates to non-American settings in compelling ways, that the specific aesthetic of the retro-futuristic 1950s works differently in a British context, that the political structures differ, that the cultural remnants of a different civilization produce different kinds of survivors. But Fallout London is not official Bethesda content. The official series has never committed to a non-American setting. Whether the other countries ever get their own games and what those games would reveal about the Fallout universe's global scope remains to be seen. Mystery 99. What the vaults were for. In the end, we've talked about the experiments, we've talked about the cover stories, and the societal preservation program, and the corporate board meetings. But the final question about the vault system, the one that the Amazon show gestures toward without resolving, is what they were actually supposed to accomplish. The standard explanation: population management for a corporate government elite that wanted to control the post-war world. But the show suggests something even more cynical, that the vaults were insurance that Vault-Tec would have leverage over whatever civilization emerged. They weren't just about controlling the population. They were about owning the future. If that's the case, then every Vault experiment, every horror inflicted on every sealed population was a contribution to a data set that was supposed to give a specific group of pre-war capitalists a competitive advantage in a world they helped destroy. The experiments were research for a product that was never delivered because the researchers died before they could take advantage of it. The vaults were built to be leverage. The leverage was never used because the people who built it didn't survive. And the populations locked inside, subjected to years of experimental cruelty, were the raw material of a power grab that ended before it could be executed. Whether that reading of the vaults is what Bethesda intended, or whether the show introduced a new layer that contradicts earlier interpretations, is itself an ongoing debate. The vault system might be the most contested piece of Fallout lore in the series' history. Mystery 100. Who are we, after all of this? Every Fallout protagonist is defined as someone who came from somewhere protected: a vault, a cryogenic pod, a pre-war frozen moment, and entered a world that has been living and dying and adapting without them. The Vault Dweller of Fallout 1, the Chosen One of Fallout 2, the Lone Wanderer, the Courier, the Sole Survivor, the Vault 76 Overseer. Each of them carries something the wasteland around them doesn't have, a direct line to what was. Whether that's actual memory, technical knowledge, cultural inheritance from their enclosed environment, or simply a frame of reference that wasn't shaped by surviving the apocalypse, they come in from outside and move through a world that formed without them. What this means for who they are and who they become, whether they integrate into the wasteland or remain always slightly outside it, whether the things they came from determine them, or whether they can become something else, is the interior mystery of every Fallout game. It's never made explicit. It's just there in the structure of every story. Someone who doesn't quite belong, walking through a world that isn't quite theirs, trying to make it better or worse, or simply to understand it. You, in the suit, with the Pip-Boy on your wrist. What are you in the end? Mystery 101. The signal that's still broadcasting. Somewhere in the capital wasteland, a radio tower is still running. Its broadcast hasn't changed since 2077. The emergency broadcast system message is still looping, telling people to proceed to designated shelter locations, still describing a world that ended 220 years ago, still speaking in the calm, reassuring tones of a civil defense apparatus that ceased to function before most of the current population's great-grandparents were born. The transmitter has nuclear power. It can keep going indefinitely. Barring a direct hit or a complete structural failure, the signal will still be broadcasting in 2377. In 2477. In whatever year it is when the last person who still speaks English turns their Pip-Boy's dial and catches the frequency and hears that voice telling them to remain calm, help is coming, please proceed to your nearest designated shelter. Help is not coming. The shelters are ruins. The world the broadcast was designed to manage is gone. But the signal keeps going anyway, because it was built to keep going. Because no one shut it off. Because sometimes the most persistent thing in the world is a message that has long since outlived its meaning, still broadcasting into empty air, still performing the function it was designed for, with no one left who knows what function that was. The Fallout universe is full of signals like this, things that persist beyond their purpose, machines that keep running, experiments that keep going, faiths that keep being practiced, songs that keep playing in empty rooms. None of it means anyone is listening. All of it means someone, once, thought they were building something that would last, and maybe that's enough. Maybe the real mystery of the Fallout universe isn't any of the specific unanswered questions, not who the mysterious stranger is, not what's under the Dunwich borers, not what Lorenzo Cabot really found in the desert. Maybe the real mystery is the same one that haunts all post-apocalyptic fiction, the question of whether any of us would do better. The people who built the vaults thought they were saving humanity. The people who designed the FEV thought they were solving war. The people who planned the nuclear exchange thought they were winning something. Everyone who made the world that way thought they had a reason, and the reasons made sense to them in the moment, and the world burned anyway. The skeletons in the chairs and the robots cleaning empty rooms, and the emergency broadcasts playing to no one, they're not lessons exactly. They're just what's left. Evidence that something was here, that it mattered to someone. That the coffee mug was placed on the table with intention, and the child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator with love, and the note left in the desk drawer was written by someone who expected to come back for it. They didn't come back. But we're here, wandering through the ruins of what they left, turning over every detail, asking what it means, which is, when you think about it, a pretty human thing to do. If you made it this far, thank you, genuinely. This was a long trip through some of the strangest and most beautiful storytelling in gaming. If any of these mysteries hit you in a particular way, or if there's one we should have covered that you think belongs on this list, leave it in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. More long-form deep dives like this are on the way, and you don't want to miss them. Stay cozy, stay curious. The Wasteland will wait. End of script. Extended section. The Mojave's Quiet Corners details worth getting lost in. Before we move into the final mysteries, there's a category of Fallout detail that doesn't fit neatly into any single thematic heading, the kind of world building that exists purely to make the Wasteland feel like a place that existed before you arrived, and will continue existing after you leave. Fallout. New Vegas is particularly rich in this material because Obsidian's design philosophy leaned hard into environmental texture. They didn't just ask, what quest can we build here? They asked, what would this place actually look like if real people had been living in and fighting over it for 2 centuries? Mystery 9-8. Extended, the nuclear bomb in the desert. In the far northeast corner of the Mojave Wasteland map, a part of the world that no quest takes you to, that has no strategic value, that most players never see, there is a nuclear bomb. Not detonated. Not in a vault, just sitting in the desert. An undetonated nuclear warhead resting in the sand with a cluster of super mutants who have set up camp around it. The bomb uses the same texture assets as the Megaton bomb in Fallout 3, which tells you something about the developer's intent. This isn't a reference to a specific narrative. It's a geographic joke. There's a nuke in the desert. Nobody knows how it got there. Nobody is doing anything about it. The super mutants are just living near it. As you do. But the detail that makes this more than a throwaway Easter egg is the question it raises about the Mojave's broader nuclear geography. The war involved an exchange of warheads across the continental United States. Not all of them detonated. Some landed in unpopulated areas, some malfunctioned, some were duds. The history of nuclear proliferation includes accidental survivals, warheads that didn't go off for one technical reason or another. In a world where the entire American landscape was a target, the probability of undetonated ordnance scattered across remote terrain is actually pretty high. The bomb in the desert is probably not the only one. Somewhere out there in the Mojave's vast uninhabited stretches, beyond the map's accessible borders, there are probably more rusting in the sand, their mechanisms degrading over decades, their existence unknown to the people who have built civilizations in the region. Someone in New Vegas's canon should probably be more worried about this than they appear to be. Mystery 9. Extended. The Fossilized Dog. In the Lonesome Road DLC, in the Cave of the Abaddon, there is a fossilized dog. Its collar reads, Seymour. The reference is to Futurama's most emotionally devastating episode, Jurassic Bark, in which Fry discovers the fossilized remains of his dog, who waited faithfully for his return, and died still waiting, not knowing that Fry had been frozen in time and could never come back. The fallout. New Vegas version of this reference is specific about its emotional payload. The dog waited. The dog is still there, preserved by time, in a cave in the post-apocalyptic desert. The person it was waiting for is presumably long dead. The fossils is all that remains of loyalty. This kind of reference, a specific pop culture nod embedded in environmental storytelling, is something Obsidian does exceptionally well. The reference works if you recognize it, and works differently but still works if you don't. You find a dog's fossil, you read the collar, you keep moving, or you stop for a moment and you carry that moment with you for the rest of the game. The Mojave is full of moments like this. Small things that don't accumulate into quests, but accumulate into something else, a texture of emotional weight that makes the desert feel like it has a history that matters. Mystery 1:00 Extended. The lean-to in the mountains. In the far southwest of the Mojave, beyond the California Sunset Drive-In, up in the Mesquite Mountains where no quest takes you, there is a lean-to, a makeshift shelter built against a rock face, a mattress, a container, a barrel for cooking, the signs of someone having been here, having stayed for a while, having tried to make something livable out of almost nothing. There's no note, no holotape, no skeleton. Just the evidence that someone was here and chose this specific spot in the mountains for reasons that made sense to them at the time. Far from major settlements, far from water sources, in a part of the map so remote that most players never see it. Who camped here? Were they running from something? Hiding from someone? Just looking for silence? Did they survive? Move on? Did anyone know they were here? The lean-to will never tell you. That's the point. The Mojave is enormous, and most of it has no story that the game will ever narrate. The world exists past the edges of what the quests can touch, and Obsidian spent time and care filling it with details that have no payoff except the payoff of making the world feel real. Additional section. The weight of inheritance. What the old world left behind. There's a pattern in Fallout that you notice once you've spent enough time with the series. The things that survive the apocalypse intact, not just physically, but culturally, are almost always the things that were built to last without needing people to maintain them. Infrastructure, music, radio signals. The propaganda posters that covered the walls of buildings in the late pre-war period, still cheerful, still telling you to report suspicious activity, still promising that Vault-Tec will keep you safe. The things that survive in degraded or transformed form. Cities, governments, families. Traditions have changed in ways that tell you exactly which features of the original were essential enough to persist and which were contingent on conditions that no longer exist. What does an economy look like when bottle caps replace currency? What does a family look like when the average lifespan in unprotected wasteland conditions is dramatically shorter? What does a religion look like when radiation is both poison and something people worship? The series' most interesting texture is the texture of inheritance of what the old world passed down to the new one, through what channels, in what forms, and with what understanding of what was being transmitted. Mystery. The Vault Boy as icon. The Vault Boy, the cheerful, thumbs-up cartoon figure that appears on Vault-Tec promotional materials, on perks, screens, on loading screens, on merchandise, is both the series' mascot and one of its most interesting thematic elements. In the game world, he appears everywhere. Posters, manuals, training materials, decorative items. He is the face of the corporation that promised safety and delivered experimentation. The Vault Boy's specific visual design, the 1950s optimism, the cheerful competence, the thumbs up that says everything is fine in the face of whatever the specific perk is describing, is a visual embodiment of the pre-war American propaganda aesthetic. His cheerfulness is the point. He smiles while explaining the effects of radiation poisoning. He gives a thumbs up next to a description of crippled limbs. He maintains complete effective neutrality across all possible outcomes. And 2 centuries after Vault-Tec ceased to exist as an operational entity, he is still everywhere in the wasteland, painted onto walls by scavengers who may not know what Vault-Tec was. Worn as fashion by people who appreciate the retro aesthetic without understanding its origin. Used as a landmark by players who have internalized him as a marker of lootable content. He survived the apocalypse better than the corporation that made him. The brand outlasted the brand's owner. The cheerful face of the entity that helped end the world smiles at you from every loading screen. Mystery, the American dream as radioactive nostalgia. The pre-war American aesthetic that Fallout preserves in irradiated amber, the houses with the white picket fences, the cars with the chrome fins, the diners with the neon signs, the advertisements promising that the future would be clean and prosperous and chrome and nuclear is not just setting design, it's argument. The divergence point in Fallout's alternate history is specifically positioned to freeze America in its most confident, most optimistic moment, the post-war consumer boom of the late 1940s and 1950s, when industrial capacity was redirected from war production to consumer goods, and the American middle class expanded dramatically, and the promise of the future felt genuinely attainable. By removing the cultural disruptions that followed the civil rights movement, Vietnam, Watergate, the 1970s malaise, the long erosion of institutional trust, the game creates a version of America that remained certain of itself while becoming increasingly monstrous. The beauty of the game's world, and it is beautiful in specific ways, especially at certain times of day, with the light hitting the ruined chrome at specific angles, is inseparable from the horror of what it represents. All that optimism, preserved in rubble, all that promise, rusted and radioactive. The dream survived. The people who dreamed it are mostly gone. Walking through Sanctuary Hills for the first time in Fallout 4, before the opening sequence jolts you into the present, you're walking through a world that was genuinely trying to be paradise. The houses are good houses. The neighborhood is a good neighborhood. The children playing in the street are playing in the way children always play. The only thing that made it all coherent was the specific historical moment it occupied, and that moment ended in a 2-hour nuclear exchange. Mystery. The ghoul as living memory. Every long-lived ghoul in the Fallout universe is a direct connection to the old world, a person who was alive before the bombs fell and who has survived, in the specific chemical and biological sense, long enough to remember. Ghouls like Raul Tejada, who was alive in pre-war Mexico and survived the bombs in the subsequent centuries, and eventually ended up as a ghoul mechanic in a super mutant camp in New Mexico. Ghouls like Three Dog, the radio DJ in Fallout 3, whose age is never specified but who operates with a historical consciousness that suggests a very long life. What makes the ghoul as living memory detail interesting is the question of what it does to a person to remember the old world, to have been alive before, to know, from personal experience, what was lost, what people dressed like, what food tasted like before Rad Ruin, what music sounded like coming from a real speaker in a real room, to have been human in the full sense that the word carried before 200 years of radiation and mutation redefined it. Raul's companion quest is the closest Fallout. New Vegas gets to explicitly addressing this. He's been alive for over 200 years and has accumulated a collection of losses so large that he's become functionally numb to them. He keeps moving because stopping would mean confronting the weight of everything he's outlived. His specific backstory, the deaths of people he loved, multiple times, across multiple lifetimes, is about what long life in a dangerous world actually costs psychologically. The ghoul population of the Fallout universe is a community of people who remember when things were different and know, in the cellular level of lived experience, that different doesn't necessarily mean better. The old world they came from made the new world they live in. The memory of what was lost is also the memory of what was worth losing. Mystery. The pre-war media bubble. Throughout the Fallout games, you can find pre-war media, films, radio programs, newspapers, advertisements, children's educational content. The picture of the world they paint uniformly optimistic, uniformly prosperous, uniformly certain of America's righteousness, and its future is visibly constructed. The propaganda is not subtle. The cheerfulness is performed. The gap between the world as these media present it and the world as you experience it in the game is the series' central visual joke, and it never stops being funny and sad simultaneously. But the interesting question about the media bubble is who it was for. Who was the audience for pre-war America's specific brand of cheerful certainty? Not the corporate executives who planned the vaults and knew the war was coming. not the government officials who authorized FEV research and managed America's increasingly authoritarian response to domestic dissent. They knew the truth. The media was for everyone else. The propaganda was for the population being managed. It was for the people who would be placed in vaults without their full knowledge, for the people whose fears needed to be managed carefully enough that they wouldn't notice the signs that the world was ending. The Vault Boy smiling while describing radiation poisoning is the entire pre-war American information ecosystem in miniature. A cheerful face placed between ordinary people and the realities their government was producing on their behalf. Section 13. The final mysteries questions the series will eventually have to answer. These are the questions that the expanding Fallout universe, the games, the show, and whatever comes next is building toward answering, or deliberately avoiding, or answering in ways that generate new questions. The series is over a quarter-century old now, and it has accumulated enough unanswered material that no single future installment can resolve everything. But some questions have moved from interesting lore gap to essential premise, things the series needs to address to tell the kinds of stories it increasingly seems to want to tell. The question of whether civilization is possible. Every Fallout game begins with the premise that the old civilization destroyed itself and asks what comes next. Every game presents multiple possible answers in the form of competing factions. The authoritarian technocracy of the Institute, the militaristic salvage operation of the Brotherhood, the frontier democracy of the NCR, the brutal order of Caesar's Legion, the techno-libertarianism of Robert House, the informal mutual aid of the Minutemen. None of these answers is presented as fully satisfactory. The NCR is democratic but corrupt and overextended. The Brotherhood is capable but xenophobic. The Institute is sophisticated but monstrous. Caesar's Legion is functional but built on slavery. House is brilliant but solipsistic. The Minutemen are well-intentioned but perpetually disorganized. The series' structural argument is that none of these models solves the underlying problem, that the problem with civilization is not a management question, or a technology question, or a structural question, but something more fundamental about what human beings are when given power over other human beings. Whether Fallout is willing to let its setting change to a point where a genuinely better answer emerges, or whether the wasteland will always be in some version of this state, is the question that determines whether the series has a direction or just a setting. The question of memory and history. The further the games move from 2077, the more important the question of historical memory becomes. The people alive in 2296, the setting of the TV show, are separated from the war by 219 years. No living person remembers it. The ghouls who do are increasingly rare and increasingly not representative of the general population. Whatever history people have of the old world comes through transmission. Stories, artifacts, records, religious traditions. Every oral tradition distorts over time. Every record-keeping system prioritizes certain things and discards others. Every generation translates history through its own needs and understandings. The question of what the post-war world actually knows about the old world versus what it believes, versus what the old world's own propaganda said about itself, is one of the richest thematic veins in the series. The question of whether the vaults served any purpose. If the vault experiments were conducted in service of a post-war plan that was never executed because the planners died, then the suffering in the vaults was meaningless. Not tragic. Tragic implies that something of value was lost in the suffering. Meaningless? People were tortured for data that was never analyzed, for purposes that were never served. The Amazon show provides one version of this by revealing Vault-Tech's plans in the board meeting scene. But the larger question, what, if anything, the Vault system actually produced in terms of the post-war world, is still open. The NCR emerged from Vault 8. The Institute has some genealogical connection to Vault 111. Specific individuals who came from vaults have shaped specific events in the post-war world. But whether the Vault system as a whole produced the outcomes that any of its designers hoped for, or outcomes worth the price of what was done to its inhabitants, is a question the series circles but hasn't answered. The question of the next Great War. The Fallout universe's founding trauma is a nuclear exchange. The factors that produced it, resource scarcity, technological escalation, corporate government fusion, information suppression, Deliberate manufacturing of consent are all present in the post-war world in modified forms. The NCR had nuclear weapons. The Institute had nuclear weapons. The Brotherhood has nuclear weapons. Vault-Tec apparently fired the first warhead that started the Great War. The conditions for a second nuclear exchange exist in the wasteland. What prevents it, in the games and the show, is roughly the same thing that prevented the first one for as long as it was prevented: mutual deterrence and functional self-interest. But mutual deterrence is not a permanent solution. It's a pause. Whether the Fallout universe is heading toward a second large-scale nuclear event, or whether the series will find a way to present genuine post-apocalyptic peace, is the deepest question in the franchise's long-term trajectory. Closing thoughts. What we come back for. Let's be honest about what Fallout is. Underneath the rad scorpions and the settlement mechanics and the 100 hours of content, it's a meditation on what we leave behind when we're gone. On the question of whether the things we build are worth the cost of building them. On what it means to inherit a world you didn't choose, that was shaped by decisions made before you arrived, that bears the consequences of choices that had nothing to do with you personally. The mysteries in this series persist not because the developers forgot to resolve them. They persist because resolution is sometimes less true than mystery. The wasteland is full of things that will never be explained, and that's not a failure. It's a feature. The world keeps more secrets than any person can uncover in a lifetime. The things we build crumble faster than we expect. The signals we send go farther than we can track. The stories we leave in journals and on holotapes and scratched into plaster outlast us by centuries, stripped of context, speaking to strangers who will make of them what they will. That's the Fallout universe. A world full of messages sent to no one in particular, about things that no longer exist in the form they were described, by people who had no way of knowing who would eventually find them. And us, sitting in the glow of a terminal screen, reading everything, trying to understand. So, was there a mystery in here that you hadn't heard before? A theory that landed differently for you than you expected? A question you think we should have spent more time on? Drop it in the comments. These conversations are how this stuff stays alive. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed, this is the right moment. Hit the button. More deep dives are coming, the kind that take the long way around, that sit with the details instead of rushing past them. You won't want to miss them. Until next time, stay cozy. The wasteland's not going anywhere. Deep dive. The texture of a ruined world, more stories the environment tells. One thing that separates the best Fallout moments from the merely competent ones is density. Not quest density or enemy density, but the density of observable history per square meter of game world. When you walk into a room in a well-designed Fallout location, you should be able to reconstruct, from physical evidence alone, the last 24 hours that room was occupied. What the people there were doing, what they ate, what they were afraid of, how quickly things went wrong. The developers who build these spaces are doing something genuinely sophisticated. They're creating archaeology for a fictional civilization, designing the artifacts of daily life in ways that communicate specific histories without any written explanation attached. The best ones reward slow, patient exploration in ways that faster playstyles will never fully access. The nursery at the end of the world. Across multiple Fallout games, not just Fallout 4, you find children's rooms that tell the story of the 23rd of October, 2077, from the most domestic possible angle. A child's bedroom in the middle of the day, bed unmade, toys on the floor, a half-finished drawing on the desk. Evidence of a morning that began normally. A child who got up and ate breakfast and probably complained about something and went about their day with no way of knowing that it was the last day. What's notable about these rooms is the specificity of the mess. The toys aren't arranged. They're scattered the way toys scatter when a child is actually playing with them rather than storing them. The half-finished drawing is recognizable as something a child was actually working on: a house, a dog, a figure that might be a parent. These details required a designer to make deliberate choices about what a real child's room would look like at the midpoint of an ordinary Tuesday. The effort put into that specificity is the thing. Someone at Bethesda sat down and thought carefully about what a child's bedroom in 2077 would contain, and then arranged those objects in a way that communicated this room was occupied by a living person a few hours ago. They didn't have to do that with such care. They did it anyway. That's the source of the emotional effect, not any single object, but the accumulation of detail that adds up to the unmistakable presence of a real person who was here and then wasn't. The office that kept running. In several office buildings across the Commonwealth and the Capital Wasteland, the workdays that were interrupted by the bombs can still be reconstructed from desk contents. The most poignant of these, and they're numerous enough that describing one is describing a template, is the desk where someone clearly left mid-task. Not in a panic. There are no overturned chairs in these spaces, no signs of the alarm bell scramble that the sirens would have produced. These are the desks of people who heard the announcement and, in the few minutes between "something is happening" and "you need to go now," methodically completed what they were working on. Placed the pen down, closed the file, logged out of the terminal, the habits of a professional lifetime so deeply ingrained that they operated even in the face of nuclear war. One specific image from Fallout 3 that players have noted repeatedly: a desk near a window with a coffee mug that had been placed on top of a document, apparently to keep the papers from blowing away in a draft. The person who did that did it automatically. They put the mug down on the papers the same way they had 1,000 times before, while the sirens were going off outside, and then they got up and went to the window to look, and then they left. And the mug is still there. The papers are still there. Whatever was on those papers was apparently worth keeping tidy even at the end of the world. The hospital that stayed open. Hospitals in the Fallout universe are among the most elaborately detailed locations in terms of pre-war environmental storytelling, because hospitals were running on the day the bombs fell the same way they ran every other day continuously, with the specific controlled chaos of a medical facility that processes multiple patients simultaneously across multiple care levels. When you walk through a ruined hospital in Fallout 4, the evidence of the last operating day is everywhere. Intake forms on clipboards at abandoned nurses' stations. Charts on doors that were last updated on the 23rd of October 2077. Supply carts parked in corridors at the exact point where whoever was pushing them stopped when they heard the alarm. In the ICU areas, monitoring equipment that still has readouts still displaying the last vital signs it recorded, frozen at the moment the power went out. Some of the hospital's rooms tell individual stories. A patient who was mid-surgery, a waiting room full of people who came in with routine problems and found themselves in the worst possible place when the bombs hit. A pediatric ward where the specific configuration of small beds and cartoon character wall murals creates an almost unbearable contrast with the rubble and the dust and the 200-year-old stillness. The hospitals are where Fallout's environmental storytelling is most honest about what the bombs actually meant at the human scale. Not the geopolitical drama, not the faction conflicts, just the specific experience of being in a place dedicated to keeping people alive and watching that project come to an end. The museum that preserved itself, Fallout 4 Inches particular, has several museum locations that are interesting because their preservation function extended, accidentally, into the post-war period. Museums store objects in climate-controlled conditions, protect artifacts from light damage, maintain inventory systems. A museum that survived the initial blast with its life support systems intact could theoretically remain in reasonable condition for quite a long time. Its climate controls keeping the temperature stable, its security systems deterring casual scavengers, its sealed display cases protecting their contents from the atmosphere. The Museum of Freedom in Concord, the first major post-tutorial location in Fallout 4, is specifically interesting because it was repurposed by both the Minutemen and their enemies for tactical purposes, but its original collection is still visible in the display cases. Pre-war American history, preserved in glass, watched over by Raider guards who presumably have no idea what they're sitting on top of. The artifacts inside these cases are physical connections to a world that most of the current population only knows through degraded stories. There's something specifically funny and specifically sad about a society that accidentally preserved its history through catastrophe. The museums survived because they were built to last. Their collection survived because someone, before the war, cared enough about the past to protect it. 2 centuries later, the people who might benefit from that preservation mostly use the buildings as fortifications. The church that filled up. In multiple Fallout games, there are churches and chapels that became shelters in the immediate aftermath of the war, places where the surviving population of a neighborhood gathered because they associated churches with safety and community and the idea that Someone there would know what to do. The evidence of this use is visible in the environmental detail. Sleeping areas improvised from pews, supplies distributed from altars, medical stations set up inside chapels. These churches turned shelters then faced whatever happened next. Sometimes the people there made it, sometimes they didn't. The specific evidence, the arrangement of personal possessions, the presence or absence of bodies, the condition of the supplies tells you which category a given church falls into before any note or holotape clarifies it. What the church as shelter image captures is the specific texture of a community's response to catastrophe, the instinct to gather, to be with other people, to seek out the specific spaces that feel associated with order and meaning when order and meaning have collapsed. The churches in Fallout weren't chosen because they were strategically optimal shelters. They were chosen because people needed to be somewhere that felt like it meant something, in a moment when nothing meant anything anymore. The broader canvas. What Fallout knows about history that other games don't. Fallout is sometimes described as a post-apocalyptic RPG with satirical elements. That description is accurate but doesn't capture what makes the series unusual in its genre. What Fallout actually is, at its most ambitious, is a sustained meditation on the relationship between civilization and catastrophe, on the question of whether human societies are moving towards something or cycling through the same mistakes with new technology. The choice to set the games in the aftermath of a nuclear war isn't arbitrary. Nuclear war is the 20th century's ultimate expression of the contradiction at the heart of modernity. The same scientific and industrial capacity that produced unprecedented material well-being also produced the means for unprecedented destruction. The atomic bomb was built by the same civilization that built antibiotics, refrigerators, and transistor radios. You can't have one without the possibility of the other. The bombs in Fallout fell because of a logic that was built into the world that made them possible. What Fallout argues consistently, across all 6 games, through every faction conflict and environmental detail, is that the problem with the old world wasn't any single bad decision. It was a systemic failure of the entire project of industrial civilization to develop the wisdom to match its capacity. The people who built the vaults were smart. The people who developed FEV were capable. The people who planned the nuclear exchange were doing what their logic required. None of them lacked intelligence. What they lacked was the will to stop a system they had built and benefited from, even when they knew what it was doing. That's not a comfortable thesis. It doesn't offer a single villain to defeat. It doesn't resolve into a clear moral lesson. The wasteland exists not because of a specific evil, but because of a specific configuration of incentives and institutions and cultural norms that made certain outcomes inevitable. And then the survivors pick up the pieces, and they build new incentives and institutions and cultural norms. And you get to watch whether any of it is different. The institutional memory problem, one of the most realistic things Fallout does, and it does it with a consistency that most games can't match, is model the degradation of institutional memory across generations. The Brotherhood of Steel, in Fallout 1, is a specific organization with a specific founding history and a specific mission that the founding members articulated clearly. By Fallout 4, 300 years later, the Brotherhood has chapters that have diverged so significantly from each other that they're barely recognizable as the same organization. The West Coast chapter maintains connection to the founding documents. The East Coast chapter under Elder Maxon has developed an aggressive, militaristic culture that the founders would have found alien. Why does this happen? Because every generation translates what was handed to them through its own experience. The founders' specific concerns about preserving pre-war technology, about maintaining humanity's best knowledge through the catastrophe, made sense in the immediate post-war context. 300 years later, those concerns have been translated into institutional practices and doctrines that have taken on their own momentum, independent of the original rationale. The Brotherhood in Fallout 4 confiscates technology not because anyone there has thought carefully about why technology preservation matters. They confiscate it because confiscating technology is what the Brotherhood does. The original reason has been replaced by the institutional habit of fulfilling the original reason. This is how all institutions work over long time periods. The original purpose becomes a tradition, and the tradition becomes a reflex, and eventually the reflex loses touch with the purpose entirely. Fallout models this with exceptional accuracy, and it does so without ever quite spelling out the analysis. You can see it happening if you pay attention to how different factions describe their own histories and compare those descriptions to the historical evidence available. The technology gap as civilization gap. The range of technological sophistication across Fallout's factions is enormous, from pre-war androids and functional teleportation devices at the top end to communities that have essentially returned to pre-industrial production methods at the bottom. This gap is not stable. It creates a specific kind of political instability. Factions with advanced technology can project power far beyond what their population size would suggest, and factions without it are dependent on trading relationships with those who have it for basic survival. The Institute in Fallout 4 is the most extreme example. A population of perhaps a few thousand scientists and support staff, living underground, wielding technological advantages so significant that the entire above-ground Commonwealth organizes itself around fear of them. They have never conquered the surface. They have never needed to. Their capacity for intervention is sufficient to shape everything without ever committing to anything. What this maps to, in the real world, is the relationship between technologically sophisticated states and less developed ones. The way that asymmetric technological capacity creates asymmetric political relationships, even in the absence of direct military domination. The Institute doesn't need to occupy the Commonwealth. It only needs to make the Commonwealth afraid of what it might do. Whether this dynamic can be broken, whether a civilization can develop in such a way that technological advantage doesn't automatically translate into political power, is a question the series raises through every faction configuration it presents. It hasn't answered it yet: the problem of justice without institutions. In the absence of functioning courts, laws, police forces, and prisons, how does a community handle wrongdoing? This is one of the most practically important questions the Wasteland faces, and it's one that every Fallout game addresses through different examples without ever synthesizing them into a general answer. Fallout. New Vegas is particularly rich in examples of improvised justice systems. The NCR has a military justice system, a civilian legal code, and a ranger corps that functions as both law enforcement and military. Caesar's Legion has a harsh but consistent system of rules, enforced immediately and without appeal. Independent communities like Goodsprings manage conflict through social pressure and the implicit threat of collective violence. The Strip's casinos have house rules that function as a kind of private law. None of these systems is presented as ideal. The NCR's legal system is slow and corrupted by the pressures of managing a frontier society. The Legion system is fast and effective, but predicated on the threat of brutal punishment and the absolute authority of Caesar. The improvised systems of independent communities are vulnerable to whoever among them happens to be strongest. What all of them share is the fundamental problem of any justice system. The legitimate use of force requires someone to wield it, and whoever wields it has incentives that don't always align with justice. The Wasteland is working through the same problems that all human societies have worked through, and the series presents those struggles without pretending there's a clean answer. Afterthoughts. The mystery of making something last. There's a small category of Fallout content that is worth singling out because it asks a question that the rest of the series approaches but rarely asks directly: what does it take to make something last? The question applies to physical objects the vaults were built to last, and mostly they did, technically, though their human contents were destroyed. The highways and bridges were built to last, and mostly they have, though they carry no traffic. The nuclear power plants were built to last, and they're still running, though the civilization they were built to power is gone. But the question applies equally to less physical things: cultures, languages, stories, the specific way of understanding the world that a civilization develops over centuries and passes down through its children. The Fallout series is saturated with examples of transmission failure of knowledge and practice and cultural form that degraded in the transmission, that arrived at its destination distorted or truncated or completely unrecognizable. The Kings in New Vegas have preserved, with extraordinary fidelity, the aesthetic of a pre-war cultural figure they know nothing about. They don't know who Elvis was. They don't know what rock and roll was. They know the hairstyle and the cadence and the white jumpsuit and the charisma that surrounded the image, and they've built an entire community identity around those preserved fragments without any understanding of what they originally meant or who they originally belonged to. This is transmission at its most melancholy and most human. Something crossed the distance from then to now. Something survived. Just not the context that would have made it comprehensible. The Kings have the style without the story, the form without the content, the costume without the person who wore it. Whether that's better than nothing, whether fragments of culture, transmitted without their meaning, you can still serve the functions culture is supposed to serve, is a question the series leaves comfortably open. The Kings seem, on balance, to be a functional community. The aesthetic they've organized themselves around gives them coherence and identity. That Elvis has been forgotten while his image persists is strange. But the image is serving its purpose, giving people a shared frame of reference, a set of norms, a way of being together. What gets lost in the transmission doesn't have to be mourned, necessarily. What arrives at the other end might be exactly what that moment needed, or not. The wasteland doesn't always let you know which one you're looking at, and sometimes the not knowing is the point. That's the universe of Fallout in 101 Mysteries, and the broader question that runs beneath all of them. What are we building? What will survive us? And what will whoever comes after us make of it? There are no final answers here. There aren't supposed to be. The best thing Fallout gives you, better than the builds and the factions and the companions, is the experience of spending time in a world that takes that question seriously and refuses to pretend it's been resolved. Pull up your Pip-Boy. There's more Wasteland to cover. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment with wherever you're tuning in from. See you in the next one. Coda, the ones that keep you up at night. There are a handful of Fallout details that don't fit cleanly into any category. They're too small to be primary mysteries, too specific to be general themes, and too stubborn to be forgotten once you've encountered them. These are the details that surface at odd moments, that you find yourself thinking about while you're doing something completely unrelated, that feel like they carry more weight than their small size suggests. The pre-war pregnancy. Fallout 4's opening sequence shows a family, the sole survivor, their spouse, and their infant son, going about their morning routine in Sanctuary Hills on the 23rd of October 2077. When the sirens start, they run. They make it to the vault. They enter the cryopods. What you notice, if you're paying careful attention to the other pods in Vault 111, is that some of them contain people who are visibly pregnant. They were frozen mid-pregnancy. Whatever their plan was, wait out the war, emerge when it was safe, continue their lives, it was interrupted at a very specific biological moment. The cryopreservation froze them, preserved them, and then Vault-Tec's agents came and killed the residents except for the sole survivor's family, and those preserved pregnancies became tragedies of a very specific kind. The game doesn't draw attention to this. There's no quest, no note, no special dialogue. The pregnant residents of Vault 111 are just there, in the pods, as environmental context. The detail required a deliberate design choice. Someone decided to include visible pregnancy in the vault's frozen population, and then chose not to build anything around it. It's just there. Another story that ended before it could complete. The bobblehead in the wrong location? Collectors of the Vault Boy bobbleheads in Fallout 4 will eventually visit every location on the map that contains one. And most locations make sense. The bobblehead, for a specific stat, is found in a location where that stat's relevant themes are enacted. The strength bobblehead in a stronghold. The intelligence bobblehead in a research facility. But a small number of bobbleheads are found in locations that seem to resist the thematic logic. They're in places that don't obviously connect to the attribute they represent, in positions that suggest they were placed there by accident or as a deliberate subversion. The most discussed of these is positioned in a way that suggests it was hidden, not displayed, not stored, but tucked somewhere it would be found only by the most thorough searcher. Why would someone hide a bobblehead? Why would a person, in the days or weeks between the bombs falling and their inevitable death from whatever killed them in that location, take the time to hide a piece of corporate promotional merchandise? Was it a game? Were they trying to preserve something? Were they, in the specific, irrational human way, trying to create a small act of meaningfulness in an environment that had stripped away every larger source of meaning? The bobblehead doesn't know why it was hidden. The person who hid it is long dead. The mystery is that someone made a choice to do something so specifically unnecessary at a moment when necessity was the only frame that made sense. The radio that picks up nothing. Late in the Fallout 3 experience, If you've been exploring the edges of the Capital Wasteland, you'll encounter radio towers that have no broadcast assigned to them. They're active, they're drawing power, they're functioning, but there's nothing on the frequency. You tune to it and you hear static. The tower is broadcasting silence. It was designed to transmit something, and whatever that something was either never materialized or was interrupted so completely that nothing remains. The game doesn't address these empty frequencies. They're not secret content. They're not ARG breadcrumbs. They're just towers doing the only thing they know how to do, broadcasting nothing into a landscape that has its own reasons for silence. In a series so rich with meaningful signals, distress calls, music, number stations, emergency broadcasts, the towers that broadcast nothing are their own kind of message. Not every signal means something. Not every transmission has a recipient. Some things broadcast simply because they were built to broadcast, and the absence of content is itself a fact about the world they exist in. The Child's Grave Without a Name. Somewhere in the Capital Wasteland, not a famous location, not a quest destination, not a frequently cited piece of environmental storytelling, there is a small grave marked with a simple wooden cross. The cross has no inscription. The mound is clearly old. The placement suggests it was made intentionally, by someone who knew this child, in a place that meant something to whoever was doing the burying. The absence of a name is the thing. Most graves in Fallout, when they have any marking at all, have something written on them, a name, a date, a few words. This one has nothing. Whether that's because the person who buried the child couldn't write, or because they couldn't bear to reduce the specific person they were mourning to a name on a cross, or because they intended to come back and add something, and never did, the game gives you no way to know. A grave without a name is a specific kind of loss. It means the memory of who this person was is entirely gone. The grave marks the fact of a death without preserving the identity of who died. 2 centuries later, you're standing in front of evidence that someone lived and died and was mourned, and you know nothing about them except that they were small enough to require only a small grave, and that whoever buried them bothered to mark the spot. That's all. That's everything. That's more than most people who died in the Fallout universe got. The mysteries in this series aren't waiting to be solved. They're waiting to be lived with. That's the difference between a mystery that's a puzzle and a mystery that's a truth. Puzzles want to be cracked, but truths want to be understood, and understanding takes more than a single revelation. Walk slowly through the next wasteland you visit. Read the terminals. Look at where the skeletons are facing and what they're holding. Check under the mattresses and inside the filing cabinets and at the backs of the shelves. The story isn't in the quest markers, it's in the space between them. It always has been. One more thing, the question nobody asks. There's a question that gets asked constantly in Fallout lore discussions: who was right? The NCR or the Legion? The Brotherhood or the Institute? House or Yes Man? These are interesting questions, and the games design them to be genuinely open, without clean answers. But the question that doesn't get asked very often is a quieter one. What did ordinary people think was going to happen? Not the faction leaders, not the philosophers and warlords and institutional architects. The farmers, the scavengers, the caravan drivers, the people working behind the counters of trading posts, and the kids growing up in settlements that might not survive the year. What did they think the world was building toward? What future did they imagine for themselves and their children? Every faction conversation in these games is, at bottom, an elite conversation. The decisions get made at the top. The consequences land everywhere. The sole survivor, the courier, the lone wanderer, they exist at the nexus of those decisions, which is why the games are about them. But the world they move through is full of people for whom the faction conflicts are simply weather. External forces that shape their conditions without asking their opinion. Fallout's environmental storytelling, at its best, gives voice to those people, not through dialogue trees and faction allegiance, but through the way their everyday lives left marks on the spaces they inhabited. The coffee mug, the grocery list, the child's drawing, the grave without a name. These are the records of people who had no vote in the decisions that ended their world, who were simply living their lives when the consequences arrived. The mysteries of Fallout are, in the end, mostly mysteries about those people. Not about the cosmic forces and institutional powers. Those are explained, eventually, in the records that institutional powers keep. The real mysteries are about the ones who didn't leave records, the ones who left coffee mugs and grocery lists, and children's drawings and graves without names. What were they hoping for? What were they afraid of? What did they love? The wasteland doesn't say, but it remembers that they were there. Bonus: 5 more mysteries that deserve their own videos. Because one list is never really enough. The burned books of Diamond City? If you look carefully at the shelves inside Diamond City's market stalls and residences, you'll find burned books alongside intact ones. Not damaged by the bombs, these show signs of more recent burning, the kind that suggests deliberate destruction rather than ancient catastrophe. Someone, at some point after Diamond City was established, burned specific books. The titles of the intact books are readable. The burned ones are, by definition, not. What was removed? Who decided it needed to be removed? What is Diamond City's community choosing not to remember? The bobblehead on the roof. There is one Vault Boy bobblehead in Fallout 4, Luck positioned on a rooftop in the ruins of Boston, accessible only by a very specific and non-obvious climbing route that requires the player to approach from an unexpected direction. It was placed there by someone before the war, or found and moved thereafter, on a rooftop, facing the sky. The Luck bobblehead, balanced on a ledge above the destroyed city, looking up at nothing. The interpretation is yours. Luck runs out. Luck runs up. The city needed more of it than it had. Whatever you decide, someone put it there, and someone else found it and didn't move it, and now it's been there long enough to feel inevitable. The music box in Vault 88. In Vault 88, the Fallout 4 DLC vault that the player helps build, there is a pre-existing room that predates the player's involvement in the already excavated sections of the vault. In this room, there is a music box, fully wound. When you approach it, it plays a brief melody. Then it stops. No context is given. No one in the vault explains it. It was there before you arrived. It wound down on its own, over what must have been decades or centuries, and was still wound enough to play a few notes when you triggered it. Someone wound it before they left. Someone cared enough about it to leave it able to play when they knew they were going. The message in the sky. In Fallout 4's Far Harbor, at specific times of day, the light conditions in the fog create visual phenomena that players have described as resembling shapes specifically, in one documented case, a shape that multiple players identified as a hand. The shape is not consistent across all playthroughs or all weather conditions, and it may be entirely the product of light refraction through the fog, combined with the pattern recognition habits of human visual systems. Or something in the fog made a shape. The children of Adam would not be surprised. The number 87. Vault 87. Fallout's FEV Ground Zero. But the number 87 appears in other contexts across the series in ways that have prompted the fan community to ask whether there's a significance being coded in. Call signs, terminal passwords, dates that reduce to 87 coordinate references. Most of these are coincidences. Large, fictional universes inevitably generate numerical patterns, if you look for them. But enough players have noted enough instances of the number in apparently non-coincidental positions that the question lingers. Whether the developers seeded the number intentionally as a thematic marker, whether it's a coincidence, or whether it's one of those numbers that the community's desire for pattern found rather than discovered, the question is itself a demonstration of what Fallout does to its players. You come for the post-apocalyptic RPG and you leave cataloging the numerical frequency of specific integers across 100 hours of content. That's the series. That's the community. That's the specific kind of love that a world this carefully made generates in the people who spend time in it.